I had always thought of the woods as quiet places where you could get away from everything for a while. I liked that stillness, that kind of heavy silence that seemed to sit on the trees and cover everything around you. I never imagined that silence could turn into something that made me feel trapped, like the trees themselves were closing in. When I decided to go deep into the woods that weekend, I thought it would be nothing more than a chance to clear my head. I had packed light, just the usual: tent, small stove, food supplies, knife, flashlight, water filter, a couple of changes of clothes, and a thick sleeping bag. I carried everything in my backpack and left early in the morning. The place I had chosen wasn't a marked campground. It wasn't even a trail that most people used. It was just a stretch of state forest that I had looked up on a map, a piece of land so deep that even hunters rarely went that far in. That's what I wanted: quiet, space, no signs of people anywhere. The first day started fine. The air was cool, a little damp from rain earlier in the week, and the ground smelled rich with wet leaves and pine needles. I hiked deeper than I had before, past streams, rocks slick with moss, and fallen trees that looked like they'd been rotting for years. Every now and then I saw signs of animals: scattered bones, claw marks on trunks, droppings in the dirt. I didn't think much of it because that was normal out there. By late afternoon, I found a clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was flat enough to set up my tent, and there was a log where I could sit while I boiled water. The silence was thicker than I expected. Usually, even deep in the woods, you hear birds, insects, the occasional crack of a branch. Here, it felt muted, like everything was holding its breath. When darkness came, I built a small fire. The air cooled fast, the temperature dropping lower than I thought it would for that time of year. I sat there watching the flames until they burned down to embers, then crawled into my tent. My sleeping bag was warm, and at first I fell asleep easily. But sometime in the night I woke up. Couldn't say why. There was no sound that I could point to, no movement that I had noticed. It was just that feeling you get when something is wrong. My heart was already beating faster, and I listened hard. At first, I heard nothing, but then, faintly, I caught the sound of something moving in the leaves outside. It wasn't far. It was slow, careful, almost like someone trying not to be heard. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the steps didn't sound like a deer. They were too steady, too heavy, not that uneven shuffle of four legs moving. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my knife, waiting. After a long moment, the sound stopped. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No prints in the soft ground, no broken branches, nothing. I shook it off, made coffee, and told myself it was just nerves, that maybe I'd been half dreaming. Still, I couldn't shake the unease, so when I packed my bag for a long day hike, I carried the knife at my belt instead of leaving it behind. I hiked further into the woods, following no real path, just moving in whatever direction looked most open between the trees. I saw no one all day, not a single footprint, not a single piece of trash, nothing that said another person had been there in years. It should have made me feel good, like I had the world to myself. But that uneasy feeling followed me. Every so often, I would stop and just listen. The forest was too quiet. That evening, I set up camp again, this time by a stream. The sound of running water helped settle me, at least for a while. I built another fire, ate a simple meal, and crawled into my tent early. I thought I would sleep better with the stream nearby, but once again, sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of movement. This time it was clearer. Something was circling the camp. Slow steps, stopping, then moving again. My skin went cold, and I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. I kept my hand on my knife, straining my ears. At one point, the steps came so close I thought whoever it was must be standing right outside the thin wall of the tent. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like hours before sleep finally dragged me down again. The next morning, I checked the area carefully. Still, no tracks, no signs of anyone having been there. The only thing I noticed was that the fire pit I'd built had been disturbed. The rocks had been shifted slightly, like someone had crouched there during the night. My stomach knotted up when I saw that. That day, I debated heading back, but part of me refused. I didn't want to admit I was scared, and I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe animals had moved the rocks. Maybe the sounds were all in my head. I pushed deeper instead of turning around. The forest seemed endless. No signs of roads, no power lines, nothing. Just miles of trees, ridges, and streams. I hiked until my legs burned, then set up camp in another clearing. I ate, drank from the stream after filtering the water, and watched the woods as the sun sank. That night was worse. I hadn't even been asleep long when I heard it again, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. Only this time it wasn't circling, came straight up to the tent. I froze, every muscle locked. The sound stopped just feet from me, and I could almost feel someone standing there, watching. Minutes dragged on like hours. Then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing. Not mine. That was when the panic truly set in. My chest tightened, my mouth went dry, and I gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt. I thought about unzipping the tent and rushing out, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, the breathing stopped, and the steps slowly retreated. I stayed awake until morning, every nerve raw. When daylight came, I got up fast, scanning the ground. This time, I found something. Just a few feet from my tent, pressed into the dirt, was a boot print. Not an animal, not my own. A heavy, deep boot print from someone who had stood there during the night. The fear that hit me then was worse than anything I'd felt before. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. Someone was following me. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed up quickly and started walking fast, heading back the way I thought I had come. The problem was, I had wandered so much the day before that I wasn't sure anymore. The woods looked the same in every direction. I tried to use the sun to guide me, but the canopy blocked most of the light. All day, I pushed myself, barely resting, always looking over my shoulder. Every snapped twig made me flinch. By evening, I found myself at another stream, but I didn't set up camp right away. I waited, listening, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sound of birds, no insects, just that thick silence again. I finally set up camp when it got too dark to keep walking. I didn't light a fire this time. I just ate a cold meal and lay in the tent, knife clutched tight, listening to every sound. The footsteps came again, slower this time, almost dragging. They circled once, then stopped. I could feel it. Whoever it was standing just outside, waiting. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. Hours passed before I heard them leave, or at least I thought they did. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was a wreck. My body ached, my head throbbed, and fear made my stomach twist. I knew I had to get out of there. I picked a direction and started moving as fast as I could, barely stopping to drink. The deeper I went, the more I realized I wasn't alone. Every time I stopped, I heard it too. The faint crunch of someone else moving, always behind me, never too close, but never far enough away either. It went on like that for hours. I tried to trick whoever it was by doubling back, by changing direction suddenly, but every time I stopped, the sound would return, always keeping pace. By the third night, I couldn't go any farther. My legs gave out and I set up camp with shaking hands. I didn't eat, didn't even bother with the tent flap. I just sat inside with my knife, staring at the fabric, waiting. The steps came again, but this time they didn't stop. The zipper on my tent twitched, just slightly, like fingers testing it. My breath caught in my throat. I raised the knife, ready to slash the second it opened, but it never did. The fingers slipped away, and the steps faded back into the trees. When dawn came, I broke camp and ran. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs nearly collapsed. Hours later, when I stumbled out onto a dirt road and saw a parked ranger truck, I nearly fell to my knees with relief. The ranger looked at me like I was crazy when I came out of the trees, dirty, exhausted, shaking, but I didn't care. He drove me back to the station, and from there, I made it home. I never went back into those woods. I never even tried to find out who had been out there with me. All I know is this: I wasn't alone and I was never meant to be out there. I never planned much for that trip. It was random, really. I had a few free days, the weather was decent, and I felt like getting out of the city. I had been stressed from work, drained from noise, screens, and traffic. So I thought a quiet few days alone in the woods would help. I packed light, nothing special, just my tent, sleeping bag, small stove, a little food, water filter, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I didn't even have a real plan of where I'd set up camp. I just drove out toward the hills, took a side road, and parked at a small gravel pull-off near a dirt trail. The trail looked barely used. That was what I wanted. I didn't want to see crowds of hikers or other campers. I wanted to be alone with the trees, the sound of wind, and the smell of dirt and pine. The path wound downhill for a while, then opened into a clearing not far from a small creek. The clearing looked flat enough for my tent, and the water meant I wouldn't have to carry too much with me. I set my pack down, stretched my back, and listened to the silence. No cars, no voices, no buzzing of phones. Just air moving through branches and the faint trickle of water over rocks. I pitched the tent near the edge of the trees where the ground was soft but not too damp. By the time I had it up, the sun was already getting lower, glowing orange through the leaves. I boiled a small pot of water on my stove, poured it into a cheap instant meal pouch, and sat there with my spoon, chewing slowly, looking around at nothing in particular. Felt good, but I noticed something strange, even the first evening. The woods felt heavy. It wasn't noise that bothered me. It was the lack of it. I expected crickets, maybe frogs from the creek, or at least the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But it was still, too still. The only sound I caught at times was wind, but even that seemed to come in short bursts before dying completely. That night, I crawled into my sleeping bag early. I wasn't tired yet, but darkness fell faster than I expected under the trees. I lay there listening, waiting for my ears to catch the usual nighttime forest chorus, but it never really came. Just silence, deep and thick, broken only once or twice by what sounded like a branch snapping somewhere far off. Each time I tried to push it out of my mind. Woods are full of noises. Branches fall. Animals move. Nothing strange. Still, I found it hard to sleep. The next morning, I felt stiff and unrest, but coffee helped. I boiled water, poured it over grounds in my little press, and sipped it while watching mist rise from the creek. The world looked calm and harmless in daylight. I decided to follow the creek deeper into the woods, just exploring. No map, no markers. I had a compass and knew the general direction back to my camp, so I didn't worry. As I walked, I saw signs that someone had been out there before, though not recently. A piece of blue tarp tangled in roots, rusty can fragments. A tree scarred where something had been nailed into it long ago. Little things like that, the kind of junk people leave behind. Nothing shocking, but enough to make me wonder how long ago the place had seen regular use. After an hour, I came across a strange thing. It was a rope, thick and frayed, tied around a tree. It hung down into the creek, swaying slightly in the current. I pulled on it, half expecting it to come loose, but it held tight, disappearing into the water where I couldn't see the end. It didn't look like it had been there for a day or two. The fibers were swollen from being soaked so long. I thought maybe someone had once tied something heavy and dropped it into the creek. Maybe a trap, maybe junk. I let go and kept walking, but the image stuck with me. By midday, I turned back. Clouds were rolling in, and I didn't want to be too far from my tent if rain came. I made it back, ate a simple lunch, and stretched out to rest. That afternoon is when I noticed the footprints. I was gathering small sticks for my stove when I saw the first one. Not mine. Too wide, too deep. It was half in mud near the creek, pressed clearly with the tread of a boot. I froze when I saw it, staring for a long moment. I had walked through that area earlier, and the mud had been smooth then, which meant it was fresh. Someone else had been here not long ago. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw no one. The woods held still, silent as before. I told myself it could have been a hunter, another hiker. Just because I hadn't seen them didn't mean much. People wander. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I followed the track a little way, enough to see a second print, and then a third heading upriver. They led into thicker brush where I couldn't follow easily. I decided not to push it. I went back to my camp and kept my knife closer than before. That night, sleep was worse. I lay there, half dozing, half awake, hearing things I couldn't place. Short, sharp sounds like quick steps, then nothing. I thought I caught a faint splash once, like someone moving in the creek. My flashlight stayed in my hand most of the night. Every time I clicked it on, the woods looked the same, empty. By the third day, I knew I wouldn't stay the full time I had planned. I felt watched even though I never saw anyone. I decided I'd pack up the next morning and head back to the car. One more night, I told myself, then I'd be gone. That afternoon, I went to refill my bottle at the creek, and when I crouched down, I noticed something wedged under the bank. A plastic container, scratched and stained, pressed into the mud. Curiosity made me tug it free. It was an old cooler, the kind you'd carry drinks in. Its lid was broken, and inside was nothing but dark water and a foul smell, like rot. I dropped it and stepped back, gagging. Why would someone leave that buried there? The whole place felt wrong now. Too many odd things. The rope, the footprints, the cooler. I wanted out, but I told myself morning was safer. Hiking out at night could get me lost. That evening, as I cooked the last of my food, I kept checking the treeline. At one point, I thought I saw movement, a figure maybe far back, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by nerves. When night came, I lay in my tent wide awake, couldn't relax. Every sound felt sharp. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it, clear as anything, the sound of water being moved. Not a small splash, but steady steps in the creek. Someone waiting. The sound grew louder, closer to where my camp sat. I held my breath, hand gripping my knife, listening so hard my ears ached. The steps slowed, then stopped. Silence again. I didn't move, didn't even unzip the tent to look. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting. Minutes crawled. Finally, I heard nothing more. At dawn, I packed fast. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack, collapsed the tent in a rush, and slung it over my shoulder. I kept my knife out the whole time. My eyes scanned the ground, and that's when I noticed more prints. They circled the clearing. Not mine. Boot tracks pressed deep into soft soil. Someone had walked around my camp while I slept. I left immediately, following the trail back the way I'd come. My pace was fast, almost a jog. Every so often, I glanced back, but the woods looked still. It took longer than I remembered to reach the gravel pull-off. My car sat just as I'd left it, but seeing it brought no relief because I noticed something else. On the back bumper, smeared faintly in mud, was the outline of a hand. I didn't waste time. I threw my pack into the seat, started the engine, and drove until the forest fell behind me. Only then did I breathe fully. I never figured out who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe just another camper or a hunter curious about me. But I know what I saw: the footprints, the rope, the cooler, the tracks circling my camp, the sound of someone moving in the creek at night, and that handprint. I never went camping alone again. I never thought the woods could feel as endless as they did that week. I had been in forests before, hiking trails, camping in national parks, wandering far enough that you couldn't hear a single car or see a single light. But the place I ended up in was different. It wasn't just trees and silence. It was deeper than I expected, thicker, more complicated. Every step I took seemed to bury me further into it, as if the woods themselves wanted me lost. I had gone alone. I don't even know why I thought it was a good idea. Maybe it was the stubbornness I've always carried, the belief that I could handle myself no matter what. I had been reading too many books about people escaping into the wilderness, living off the land, finding peace away from the world. That kind of life sounded tempting, at least for a short while. I thought if I could just disappear into a place with no phone service, no noise, no people, I'd come back stronger, more clear-headed. So I packed my bag, my tent, a small stove, and just enough food to stretch for several days if I rationed right. My plan was to hike into the deep woods, set up camp far from the main trails, and spend a week alone. The first day felt fine. The ground was firm beneath my boots. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the sun slipped through the branches in a way that made everything look alive. I felt strong with every step. My pack was heavy, but I was used to carrying weight. I kept track of where I turned, following a rough direction, marking a few trees with a knife just in case. I had studied maps before I left, memorized the shape of the rivers and ridges, and told myself I would never stray too far without paying attention. But the deeper I walked, the more the woods started to feel like a maze. The trees looked the same in every direction. The ground dipped and rose without warning. The trail I thought I was following faded into grass and rocks. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that's what I came for, to be away from man-made trails. I wanted to feel swallowed by the wilderness, and now I had it. By the time the sun started to lower, I found a flat patch near a fallen log and set up my tent. I boiled water, ate a meal, and stretched out inside. The woods at night were louder than I expected. Every crack of a branch, every shuffle of leaves made me freeze. I had been in the woods enough to know the sounds weren't unusual. Animals moved at night, insects chirped, trees groaned. Still, it felt different when there was no one else around. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, waking often to the rustle of something outside. The next morning, I pushed further. I wanted to reach the river I had seen on the map, a long winding one that curved through the forest like a snake. If I could get there, I'd have water and I could follow it back out when I was done. But the deeper I went, the more unsure I became. The ground was softer, swampy in parts. The trees grew so thick that sunlight barely made it through. I couldn't tell how far I had walked. I checked my watch, checked the compass, checked the markings I had left behind, but something felt off. The compass needle twitched, sometimes pointing in a direction that didn't match the slope of the land. I tried not to panic. I kept walking, telling myself all I needed was to find the river. Hours passed. The woods pressed in closer. I felt sweat soaking through my shirt, stinging my eyes. My food felt lighter in my bag, though I hadn't touched much. I stopped to drink water, but even that made me nervous. My bottles were full, but I didn't know when I'd reach a reliable source again. I hadn't seen the river. I hadn't even heard running water. That night, I camped in another small clearing. My legs ached from climbing uneven ground. I could feel blisters forming in my boots. My hands shook as I lit the small stove. I ate quickly, too anxious to enjoy it. The sounds around me were louder than the first night. I could hear something moving through the brush, heavier than a rabbit or raccoon. It moved slow, stopping and starting, like it knew I was there. I sat with my back against the log, staring into the dark, every muscle in my body ready to bolt. But nothing came close enough to see. After hours of staring, exhaustion forced me into shallow, restless sleep again. The next day, I realized I was already running low on food. My plan had been a week, but I had underestimated how much I'd eat under the stress of walking all day. I told myself I had to find the river that day. I hiked harder, moving faster, ignoring the ache in my legs. But the deeper I pushed, the less the woods made sense. I tried to keep the sun on my left, then on my right, switching as the day shifted, but it didn't matter. The woods bent around me in ways I couldn't explain. I crossed the same kind of slope twice, past the same fallen tree even though I hadn't turned back. My knife marks were gone from the bark I had cut, or maybe I had lost track of where I made them. By late afternoon, I felt the first wave of real panic, the kind that sits in your stomach and won't leave. I dropped my pack, pulled out the map, and laid it on the ground. The lines and marks I had studied didn't match what I was seeing. I turned it in circles, tried to match the ridges, but it was useless. I felt my chest tighten, heat rising in my face. I slammed the map back in my bag and forced myself to keep moving. I told myself I'd climb the next hill, get a better view. But when I reached the top, all I saw were trees stretching in every direction, endless and dark, the horizon lost behind layers of green. That night was worse. Something moved closer to my camp. I could hear sticks snapping, the low drag of something heavy brushing against the ground. My firelight flickered, throwing shadows that looked like figures between the trunks. My hands clenched around the knife as I sat in the dark, eyes wide, throat dry. I couldn't tell if it was an animal, a person, or just my mind breaking down from exhaustion. I didn't sleep at all. By dawn, my nerves were shot, and every sound made me flinch. On the fourth day, I noticed I was rationing water more than food. My bottles were half empty. My throat felt raw, and my lips cracked as I licked them. I hadn't found the river. I hadn't even seen damp ground that could hint at it. My mind started drifting to thoughts I didn't want to have. What would happen if I couldn't find water, if I couldn't find my way out? I shook them off, tried to focus on moving forward. But the woods grew darker, thicker. The trees seemed closer together, the ground rougher. I tripped often, cutting my hands on rocks and roots. My body felt heavier with every step. I kept hearing noises that day, not just rustling, but sharper sounds. Branches snapping in the distance, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times in a row like footsteps. I froze when I heard them, crouched low, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I stared into the trees until my eyes watered, but I never saw what caused it. I forced myself to move, telling myself it was just deer, maybe a bear keeping its distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random. It felt like something was keeping pace with me, staying just far enough to remain unseen. By the 5th day, I was half out of food and almost out of water. My legs felt weak, and my body shook when I tried to stand. I didn't even remember how far I had gone or how many turns I had taken. My head pounded with dehydration. My skin felt hot under the sun that broke through gaps in the trees. I staggered more than I walked. My pack felt like a dead weight I couldn't carry anymore. I left half of it behind near a rock, only keeping what I thought I needed most: the knife, the empty bottles, a little food, and the sleeping bag. That night, I couldn't even set up my tent. I just laid the sleeping bag near a tree and curled inside it, shivering even though the air was warm. My body felt like it was shutting down, every muscle tight and trembling. I thought I heard footsteps again, closer this time. I thought I heard breathing. My eyes darted open, but I couldn't move. I stayed frozen, staring into the dark, too weak to do anything if something stepped into the clearing. But nothing did. Nothing came close. Still, I didn't sleep. My body wouldn't let me. On the 6th day, I tried to follow the slope downward, thinking maybe it would lead me to water. I stumbled for hours, falling more often than I stayed upright. My knees were raw, my palms scraped and bleeding. My vision blurred, spots of black cutting across it when I blinked. At one point, I thought I saw movement ahead, a figure between the trees. I blinked hard, focused, but it was gone. My stomach sank. I didn't know if it had been real. My mind was slipping, and I couldn't tell what was in the woods and what was only inside my head. By evening, I couldn't go any further. I dropped against a log, my chest heaving, my throat dry as sand. I wanted to keep moving, but my body wouldn't respond. I sat there until darkness swallowed everything, my head dropping forward. I thought about home, about the noise of cars, the simple comfort of turning on a faucet. I thought about how stupid I had been to come out here alone, thinking I could handle it. The 7th morning, I woke to the sound of water. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The faint trickle just... I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors, so being alone in the woods never really scared me. I was used to the quiet, the way the trees seemed to close in around you, the long stretches of silence broken only by wind or the snap of a branch. Over time, I even started to like the stillness. But the woods can change on you. They can shift from calm to threatening without warning, and once they do, you realize how far away from safety you really are. I decided to take a trip deep into the forest late in September. I picked a stretch of land that wasn't on any major trail system. I had been there once before, years ago, with a friend. We had gone just a couple of miles in, set up camp, fished in the creek, and left the next morning. This time, I wanted to go farther. I wanted to push deep into the tree line, where I wouldn't see or hear another person for days. The thought of that kind of isolation excited me. I packed heavy because I planned on staying for nights. A good tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food sealed tight, a big water filter, knife, hatchet, some paracord, a headlamp with extra batteries, and a map with my compass. I double-checked everything. I made sure to tell someone where I was going and when I'd be back. I didn't think I'd need that safety net, but I wasn't stupid. The hike in was harder than I remembered. The trail I had been on years ago was barely visible now. Bush had grown thick, fallen branches blocked the way, and I found myself stopping every few minutes to either catch my breath or cut through brush with my hatchet. Sweat ran down my back, and the pack dug into my shoulders. I could feel the straps rubbing my collarbone raw, but I pressed on. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. By the time the sun hit its peak, I was several miles in, and the forest around me felt untouched, almost like no one had been through here for years. That first night was calm. I found a flat spot near a stream, pitched my tent, and got a fire going. I cooked some food and sat there watching the flames throw light against the dark wall of trees. The forest sounds were soft, frogs near the water, insects humming, the occasional rustle in the brush. I wasn't nervous at all. If anything, I felt comfortable. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, the sound of the stream running nearby pulled me right into sleep. The second day, I hiked even deeper. I wasn't following a trail anymore, just my compass and the general direction I wanted to go. The ground was uneven, soft in places where dead leaves hid mud, steep in others where roots clawed up through the dirt. Around midday, I found a clearing where a few trees had fallen, maybe from a storm. I thought about making camp there but decided against it. I didn't like the way the dead trees leaned over. It looked unstable. By late afternoon, I found a spot I liked. A small rise above the ground, dry, with a line of rocks forming almost a natural wall on one side. It felt protected. I set up camp again, built another fire, and tried to enjoy the evening. That night was different. I noticed it as soon as the fire burned low. The woods felt off. The sounds I had heard the first night weren't there. The frogs were silent. The insects were gone. The whole place felt hollow, as if everything living had moved away. I sat there staring into the dark, listening for something, anything, but all I caught were faint cracks in the distance, like something moving carefully between trees. I told myself it was just deer. That was the most likely answer. Still, the feeling stayed with me. When I finally went to bed, I kept waking up. My ears caught faint snaps and the crunch of leaves. Once, I swore I heard something brush against my tent wall, but when I sat up and clicked on my headlamp, there was nothing. The beam of light caught only the thin nylon walls and the condensation gathering there. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep never really came. In the morning, I stepped outside, stiff and tired. The ground around my tent looked normal at first, but when I walked a few feet out, I noticed impressions in the dirt. Not boot prints, not shoes, just deep, odd depressions in the soft soil. They weren't shaped right for animals either. I crouched down and studied them, my stomach tightening. They almost looked like bare feet, but wider, heavier. Too wide for me, too heavy for a person not wearing shoes. I felt my skin prickle. I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Maybe water had pooled and left strange marks. Maybe I was just tired, but the unease clung to me. I packed up quickly and kept moving. By the third day, I felt drained. Hiking with little sleep was catching up to me. My shoulders burned from the pack, and every step seemed heavier. I kept drinking water, kept eating, but I couldn't shake the fog in my head. Still, I pushed forward. I wanted to reach a ridge I had seen on the map, a high point where I could look out over the land. If I got there by the afternoon, I'd camp just below it. When I finally made it, the sun was dipping low. I stood on the ridge, chest heaving, and looked out at miles and miles of forest stretching endlessly. No towns, no roads, nothing but waves of green broken by shadows where valleys dipped. It should have been beautiful, but instead, it made me feel small, trapped in a place that could swallow me whole without a trace. That night, things escalated. I built my fire as usual, cooked a small meal, and sat back against a log. The silence was worse now, It was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, just past the edge of the firelight, I caught movement. Not quick, slow. Something large shifting between trees. I froze, staring hard, but the dark made everything blend together. A sound followed, soft, deliberate footsteps. Too heavy for a deer, too slow for a bear. They circled, always just far enough away that the firelight didn't touch. My hands shook. I wanted to grab my hatchet, but I didn't want to move too much, didn't want to draw attention. I stayed still, barely breathing, watching shadows until my eyes burned. Eventually, the sounds faded. Hours later, I crawled into my tent, but I left the fire going. I lay there stiff, clutching the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. Sleep never came. At some point in the dead of night, I heard it again. This time closer, right outside my tent. The sound of weight pressing into the dirt. Slow breathing, low and steady. I held my breath, every muscle screaming to move, but I stayed still. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. The shadow of something passed over the faint glow of my tent wall. It lingered there, unmoving, for what felt like forever. Then, finally, it shifted and faded away. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed fast, barely ate, and started moving back the way I came. Every noise behind me felt like it was following. Every snap of a branch sent jolts through me. I kept checking over my shoulder, certain I'd see something there. The hike back felt endless. I tried to stay on course, but the forest twisted me around. Hours passed with no sign of familiar ground. My water ran low. My legs felt like they'd give out. And then I saw them again, the prints. Those wide, heavy impressions in the dirt, leading the same way I was heading. Only fresher this time. Panic set in. I pushed harder, stumbling through brush, scraping my arms and legs, ignoring the burning in my chest. I just wanted out. I wanted the edge of the forest, the safety of my car, anything but the endless trees. By the fourth night, I couldn't keep going. Exhaustion pinned me down. I set up camp in the bare minimum way, too drained to even eat. Darkness fell fast, and with it came the sounds again. Circling, watching, closer now. I sat with my knife in hand, staring at the tent wall, knowing something was out there. When the first light broke through the trees, I didn't even bother packing. I grabbed my pack half-zipped, left most of my things behind, and just ran. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept going. Hours passed in a blur of green and brown until finally, mercifully, I saw the faint line of the old trail I had come in on. I don't remember much after that, just pushing forward, not daring to look back. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw my car sitting where I left it, I nearly collapsed. I threw my pack inside, jumped in, and drove without stopping, not even looking in the rear view. Even now, I don't know what I saw. I don't know what was following me out there. All I know is the woods weren't empty, and whatever was moving through them wanted me gone. I haven't been back since. I had always liked being outdoors, but I had never gone too far off trails before. Most of the time I stuck close to marked paths, carried a map, and made sure I didn't lose sight of where I was. That summer, I decided I wanted to push myself. I told myself that the best way to really test what I could handle was to go deeper into the woods, away from where most people hiked, away from where it felt safe. I packed food, water, a small tent, and a knife. I thought I had everything under control. I didn't think about what it would feel like to be truly cut off from everything. The first day was easy. The sun was out, the air was warm, and the woods seemed calm. I walked for hours, following faint signs of older trails that looked like they hadn't been used in a long time. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. I stopped hearing the distant sound of cars or people. There were no wrappers or cigarette butts on the ground. It felt untouched. That part of it was exciting, like I had reached somewhere most people never bothered to go. I set up my tent that evening in a small clearing with thick trees on all sides. I made a small fire, ate some food, and listened to the sounds around me. There were crickets, the distant call of a bird now and then, the rustling of branches when the wind passed. It didn't feel threatening, felt almost peaceful. I lay in my tent that night thinking I had done the right thing coming out here. The next morning I packed up and kept walking. I decided I would go one more day deeper before turning back. The ground became uneven, and thick roots pushed out across the pathless floor of the woods. I had to climb over fallen logs and squeeze between trees that grew so close together they felt like walls. I sweated heavily under my pack, and the air seemed heavier, damper, like the light barely made its way down through the canopy. By the middle of the day, I realized I hadn't heard a bird in hours. No bugs either, except for a few mosquitoes that stuck to me like glue. The silence was strange. I tried to ignore it and kept going, marking the trees lightly with my knife so I could find my way back. The deeper I went, the darker it felt, even though the sun was still up. That evening, I had trouble finding a good spot to set up camp. The ground was too uneven or covered in thick brush. Finally, I settled near a cluster of tall pines where the ground flattened out just enough to pitch my tent. I made a fire again, though the wood burned slower and smoked heavily. The smoke clung to the air instead of drifting up. I ate but didn't feel very hungry. Something about the quiet pressed down on me. When I lay in my tent that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint snaps, like twigs breaking, but far off. Every time I tried to convince myself it was just the woods, another sound came. Sometimes it was a crack, sometimes a soft thud, sometimes what sounded like a shuffle in the leaves. My chest felt tight. I told myself it was animals. Out here, there had to be deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But the sounds didn't fade. They moved, sometimes closer, sometimes further, never steady. I hardly slept at all. In the morning, I thought about turning back early, but something in me said I could handle one more day. I hated the idea of leaving and feeling like I had been scared off. I told myself if I could go just a little deeper, I would feel like I had beaten whatever nerves had crawled into me. I walked for hours again. The woods thickened so much I had to force myself sideways between trees at points. My legs ached from climbing over logs and slipping on moss. At one point, I fell to my knees and tore my pants on a sharp branch. My hands were dirty, my arms scratched, and sweat stung the cuts. It was around mid-afternoon when I found something that stopped me cold. I came across an old campsite. The fire pit was filled with blackened wood that had long since gone cold. A half-buried pot rusted in the dirt. The tent was collapsed, the fabric ripped and shredded like it had been slashed through. Moss grew over the edges of a faded sleeping bag that was half buried in leaves. At first I thought maybe it was just abandoned years ago, but then I noticed the odd details. The ripped tent didn't look like age had done it. The cuts were clean, like with a blade. The pot wasn't just rusted, it was dented. The sleeping bag looked like it had been dragged. I stood there staring, my mouth dry, the air around me heavy. I couldn't shake the thought that someone had left in a hurry, maybe not by choice. I felt the urge to leave right then, but I also felt like if I turned back, I'd have to walk past that spot again. I pushed on, deeper still, trying not to think about it. That night, when I set up camp, I couldn't relax at all. I didn't build a fire, worried it might draw attention. I sat in the dark, listening, every muscle in my body tense. The woods were silent, too silent. No bugs, no wind, nothing but the faint drip of water somewhere far away. Then the noises started again. Not far off like before, but closer. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching under weight. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying not to be heard but failing just enough that you catch it. I froze inside my tent, clutching my knife. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining for every sound. The steps circled, moved away, then came back. My skin felt tight, like it didn't fit right on my body. I stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand, barely blinking. When light finally broke through the trees, I packed up and decided I had to leave. I followed the marks I had cut into the trees, but after a while I realized something was wrong. The marks didn't look like mine. Some were slashed deeper, rougher, angled differently. I walked faster, panic crawling up my throat. It was like someone had copied what I had done, but not exactly, and I couldn't tell which ones were mine anymore. I kept moving, hoping I was going in the right direction, but the woods felt endless. Every tree looked the same, every log looked familiar, like I was walking in circles. The sun moved higher, but the canopy was so thick I couldn't even use it to tell direction. Hours passed. My water ran low, my food barely touched. My throat was dry, my head aching. Then I found it, another campsite, not the same one as before. This one was newer but still abandoned. A pair of torn boots lay beside a collapsed tarp. A metal mug lay on its side, still stained dark inside. The ground looked disturbed, like someone had dug or dragged something heavy. I felt sick. My body screamed at me to keep moving, to get out before it was too late. That night, I didn't bother with the tent. I sat against a tree with my knife in hand, staring into the dark. The noises came back, closer than ever. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving through the brush. A crack, a crunch, then silence. Waiting, listening back. I don't know how long I sat there before exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, it was to the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground nearby. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I stayed still, barely breathing. Whatever it was moved slowly, the sound of weight over leaves and dirt. Then it stopped. I couldn't tell if it was 10 feet away or 100. The dragging started again, fading into the trees. I forced myself up, weak and shaking, and ran. I didn't care what direction anymore. I ran until my chest burned and my legs felt like they might give out. I tripped, fell, scrambled up again, dirt in my mouth, sweat stinging my eyes. By afternoon, I stumbled out into a stretch of land where the trees thinned and the ground sloped downward. I followed it, desperate, and finally saw something that nearly made me collapse with relief. A logging road, rough and overgrown, but still a road. I followed it until my legs could barely carry me, and eventually I reached a ranger station, empty but intact. I found a radio inside, dead at first, but after fumbling with the power, I caught a weak signal. My voice shook as I called for help. Hours later, headlights cut through the trees, and I nearly cried when I saw the truck roll up. I never told them everything. I said I got lost, that I panicked, that I thought I heard animals at night. I didn't mention the ruined campsites, or the sounds of footsteps, or the dragging. I didn't mention the marks on the trees that weren't mine. I just wanted out. Even now, safe and home, I can't stop hearing those noises when the night gets too quiet. The silence pressing down, the steps circling, the dragging weight moving slowly through the trees. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I only know one thing for sure. I will never go back into the deep woods again. I had been planning to go out into the woods for a while, not for fun, not for camping, not to prove anything, but mostly because I wanted space. I had been feeling trapped inside my routine, inside the noise of town, and the thought of being swallowed up by the silence of the forest was the only thing that sounded right. I picked an area I had read about once, not popular for hikers, not filled with campgrounds, just long stretches of thick forest that most people avoided because it was too easy to get turned around. I told myself I would only stay one night, hike in until I found a spot that felt hidden, stay there, and then make my way back out the next morning. The drive out there was quiet. Once the pavement ended, the dirt road was narrow and rough, filled with potholes and lined with trees that arched overhead and made the light dim even in the middle of the day. I parked at a small pull-off where the road widened just enough for a single vehicle to stop without blocking anyone else. The woods stretched out in front of me like a wall, thick, dark, and tangled. There was no trail sign, no marker, no clear path, just what looked like faint deer runs weaving between trunks. I tightened my pack straps, locked my car, and stepped into the forest. The first hour was easy enough. The sun was still high, and even though the canopy blocked most of it, patches of gold light bled through the leaves and dappled the ground. I kept track of the direction with a small compass I carried, making sure I didn't stray too far from my line. I didn't bring a GPS because I told myself it was about disconnecting, about not relying on devices. The air smelled sharp, damp, earthy. the kind of smell you only get deep in the trees where rot and growth mix together. As I moved deeper, the sounds of the world thinned out. At first, there were birds and insects, the normal chatter of the woods, but the further I went, the quieter it seemed to get, like layers of sound were being peeled away. My boots sank into soft earth, crunching now and then on dry branches. The trees grew thicker, closer, and some areas were so choked with undergrowth that I had to push my way through, scratching my arms and catching my pack on branches. After another hour, I found a spot that looked like a good place to settle. A small clearing, not wide but enough to spread out a sleeping bag, ringed with tall pines and a couple of leaning oaks. I dropped my pack, took a long drink from my water bottle, and just stood there, listening. There was no wind, no bird calls, nothing moving. It was so quiet that I could hear the pounding of my heart in my chest, and that silence settled over me in a way that was heavier than I expected. I set up my small tarp shelter, gathered some wood from around the clearing, and made a small fire. The flames licked at the air, the smoke rising and curling before disappearing into the dark branches above. The warmth was a comfort, even though the day hadn't been cold. Something about fire in the woods feels like a boundary, like it marks your space and keeps the shadows at a distance. I ate from a small bag of food I had brought, then leaned back on my pack and stared into the trees. As the sun dropped, the woods darkened fast. The green of the leaves turned black, the trunks became pillars rising into nothing, and the sky above, what little of it I could see, shifted from blue to deep gray. The fire popped and cracked, throwing short bursts of light across the clearing. That's when I started hearing it. It wasn't sudden. It began faint, almost like I imagined it. A snapping sound, like a footstep on dry twigs. I sat still, listening hard, my eyes scanning the treeline. The fire behind me threw my shadow long across the clearing, making it harder to see into the woods. I waited, holding my breath. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even just a branch falling. But the stillness of the woods made every noise stand out sharp, and once you hear something out there, you can't unhear it. I went back to feeding the fire, keeping it strong, keeping it bright. The next sound was closer. Another crack, followed by the faintest brush of leaves. My chest tightened. I turned slowly, scanning between the tree trunks, but there was nothing but blackness beyond the fire's glow. I knew it wasn't the wind. The air was still as stone. Something was moving out there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself animals live out here, that I was the stranger in their home, that this was normal. But the longer I sat, the more I felt it, eyes watching. The back of my neck prickled, and no matter which way I turned, the feeling stayed, like something was just beyond where I could see, fixed on me. The night deepened. The fire burned low, and I fed it more wood just to keep from sitting in darkness. I didn't sleep. My body wouldn't let me. Every few minutes I would hear another sound. A step, a shift, sometimes so faint I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind stretching silence into noise. When the first light of morning finally bled into the trees, I felt some of the weight lift. The woods weren't safer in daylight, but at least I could see. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my stomach turned with a nervous emptiness. I packed up quickly, smothered the fire, and made sure I had everything. My only thought was to get out, to retrace my way back to the car. But the forest looked different. The faint paths I had followed in seemed to vanish overnight. Every tree looked the same, every direction twisted into another. I checked my compass and picked the line I thought would lead me back, but the further I went, the more I doubted myself. The undergrowth was thicker, the ground more uneven, and there were places where I had to crawl under low branches, places I didn't remember coming through. After 2 hours of walking, I realized I wasn't going the right way. My heart pounded in my throat, and sweat slicked my back despite the cool air. I forced myself to stop, sit on a log, drink some water, and calm down. Panic wouldn't help. I still had supplies, still had the compass, still had daylight. I told myself I would find the road if I just kept steady. But then I saw it. On the ground near where I sat was a print. Not an animal print, not the hoof of a deer or paw of a bear. It was a boot print, clear in the soft soil, pressed deep. The size looked close to mine, maybe a little bigger. I froze, staring at it. I hadn't walked here before. I knew that for sure, which meant someone else had. Recently, I scanned the trees, every sense screaming. The silence was thick again, heavier now. I stood, slowly, and without even meaning to, I turned in a circle, looking for movement, for anything. There was nothing but trees. I moved faster after that, not running but close. My eyes darted to the ground, looking for more prints, but they vanished after a short stretch. I couldn't shake the thought that someone else was in these woods, not far, maybe even following. The steps I had heard in the night, the feeling of being watched, the boot print. It all threaded together in my mind, and no matter how I tried to reason it, it twisted into fear. The day dragged on, and I was no closer to the road. The forest seemed endless, an ocean of trunks and shadows. My legs burned, my shoulders ached from the pack, and my throat was dry despite rationing water. As the light began to fade again, my chest tightened with dread. I didn't want another night out here, not after what I had heard, not after what I had seen. But I had no choice. I found another clearing, smaller than the first, and set up again. My hands shook as I built a fire, the wood damp and stubborn. When the flames finally caught, I sat close, hugging my knees, staring out into the darkening woods. The sounds started earlier this time, not faint, not far. Closer. A crack, a shuffle, a slow drag of something over leaves. My whole body went rigid. The firelight flickered, and beyond it, the trees seemed alive with shifting shadows. I gripped a small hatchet I carried, my knuckles white. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. The noises never stopped, sometimes circling, sometimes fading, sometimes so close I swore I could hear breath. But I never saw anyone, never saw a shape. Just trees, just blackness. When dawn came again, I was hollow, drained, half convinced I was losing my mind. I packed up, though my movements were clumsy and slow. I told myself to keep moving, to keep trying, but a part of me knew I was deeper now, farther from where I started, and whoever else was out there, they knew this forest better than me. By midday, I stumbled onto something that made my stomach drop. Another clearing, but it wasn't empty. There were signs of a camp. Not fresh, but not old either. A circle of stones from a fire pit, blackened with ash. A tree trunk with marks carved into it, deep grooves like someone had sharpened blades there. And on the ground, half buried in leaves, an old jacket, torn and stained. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, my skin crawling, my mind racing. Whoever had stayed here wasn't far. Maybe they still came back. Maybe they had been watching me all along. I turned and kept moving, faster now. I never liked how quiet the deep woods could get. I grew up spending weekends outside, walking trails and camping with nothing but a pack, but I had always stuck to familiar places. When I finally pushed myself to go far, to walk into the type of forest where no trail sign stood and no human noise carried, I thought it would be a simple test of my nerves. I wanted to feel the kind of isolation people talked about, where the land swallows you, where you stop hearing cars or planes, where all you know is the earth under your boots and the trees stretching in every direction. I picked a remote section of forest I had found on maps, the kind of land that didn't have a name printed on most guides, just patches of dark green on the satellite view. It looked endless, with streams cutting through it and ridges that rose and fell like waves. There were no marked trails, no campsites. I parked my truck on the side of a narrow service road that looked like it hadn't been driven in months. The grass grew tall through cracks in the gravel. I left the truck locked, gear on my back, and stepped in with the plan to go 2 days in, one night, and return before dark the following evening. I figured I could handle it. At first, the walk was calm. The trees were thick but spaced just enough to move through. The ground was damp but solid, with patches of moss clinging to fallen trunks. The air was cooler inside, the shade pressing down as I moved. Every sound I made seemed louder than it should have been. The creak of my straps, the thud of my boots, the rasp of branches sliding against my jacket. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the woods were folding around me. Hours passed and the quiet started to weigh. I had food, water, and a map in my pack, but maps only tell so much. The ridges were taller than I expected. The streams ran deeper. At one point, I slipped down a slope, landing hard on wet leaves, and it took me almost an hour to climb back to where I thought I was supposed to be. The sun slid lower, its light bending into thin beams through the canopy. I decided I'd stop soon, make camp before I lost light. I found a flat patch between two ridges, hidden from the wind. I cleared sticks, set my small tent, and unpacked food. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was thick, heavy, like the woods had pulled a blanket over me. When I boiled water on my small stove, the hiss of the flame seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. I ate quickly, cleaned up, and sat with my back against a tree as the light drained away. The night hit fast. The dark out there wasn't the kind of dark you find near towns. It was heavy and total, the kind that made you blind the second you turned your head away from your flashlight. I lay in my tent listening to the forest breathe. Every now and then I caught the crack of branches far off, the shuffle of leaves like something moving slow. I told myself it was deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, I didn't sleep much. At dawn, I pushed on, deeper. I wanted to reach a small river I had marked on the map. The land grew harder. The ground angled upward. The brush grew thicker. I hacked through vines, stumbled over roots, slid in mud that sucked at my boots. My arms burned from shoving branches aside. I kept thinking about how far I had gone from the road, how much harder the walk back would be. By midday, I reached the river. It wasn't wide, but it moved fast, cutting deep between banks lined with stones and twisted trees. The water was loud, rushing hard enough that I had to raise my head to hear it over the silence I had grown used to. I sat, filled my bottle, and let my legs rest. That was when I noticed something that set my nerves crawling. Across the river, half hidden by brush, there was a piece of blue fabric stuck on a branch. It was small, torn, but the color stood out in the sea of green and brown. I crossed on stones slick with moss, nearly falling twice, and made my way over. The fabric was from a jacket sleeve. The edge was ripped like it had been caught hard. Beneath it, the dirt looked pressed down, not by animals, but by boots. I crouched, running my hand over the soil. The impressions weren't fresh, but they were there, sunken into the mud in shapes too long and straight to be hooves or paws. Someone had been there, maybe not recently, but recently enough that the ground hadn't erased it yet. I stood up and looked around. The woods were silent again. The fabric fluttered faintly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Something about it made the back of my neck tighten. I told myself hikers sometimes cut through unmarked areas. People get lost and leave things behind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be there. I pushed on, but I marked the spot in my mind. As the day dragged, I found more signs. A tree with bark scraped off at shoulder height, not by an animal, but by something sharp. A pile of stones that looked placed, not natural. Even a rope tied high in the branches of a tree, frayed and weathered. None of it made sense to me. It didn't feel like the remains of casual campers. Felt wrong. When the second night came, I regretted going so deep. I pitched my tent near the river but didn't eat much. My stomach was tight. The woods weren't just quiet, they were watchful. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent, listening hard. Around midnight I heard it. Soft footsteps. Not far, moving slow, circling. My breath caught. The steps were light but steady, too careful to be an animal crashing through brush. I froze, every muscle stiff. The steps stopped outside the thin wall of my tent. I waited, barely breathing, and then there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Finally, I forced myself to sit up, grip my knife, and listen. Still nothing. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but it was the kind of sleep filled with shallow dreams and jolts awake. When dawn broke, I packed fast. My plan to explore more vanished. I wanted out, but the woods weren't the same anymore. Every tree looked like the last. Every ridge led to another. My compass said north, but the land kept pulling me sideways. The trails I thought I remembered weren't there. By noon, I realized I was lost. I tried to stay calm, moving slow, drinking water, checking my map against the sun. But as the day bled away, I kept stumbling across the same things. The same twisted tree, the same patch of stones. Once, I even found the same torn blue fabric I had seen the day before, though I swore I had moved miles away from it. My skin went cold. Either I was walking in circles or something was pulling me back. That night, I didn't set a tent. I climbed into a cluster of thick brush, curled into myself, and stayed still. My nerves were shot, my body shaking. The woods breathed heavy around me. In the distance, faint but real, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not running, not stumbling, but slow, steady, deliberate. They came and went, fading in and out. I couldn't see anything, but I felt eyes on me. By morning, my throat was dry, my head pounding. I forced myself up and kept moving. I followed the river downstream, thinking it had to lead somewhere. Another road, maybe a house. My legs ached, my feet blistered. The woods stretched endless. By late afternoon, I found something that made my chest lock tight. Fire pit. Stones stacked in a ring, ashes inside, cold and scattered. Around it were bones, small ones cracked open. A tarp lay crumpled nearby, stained dark. It was clear someone had been living there, but not like a camper. More like someone hiding. I backed away, my breath shaking. Every sound seemed sharper. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, my own heartbeat pounding. I didn't want to stay near that place. I turned, moving as fast as I could without running. The trees closed in tighter, the light dimming faster than it should have. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept my knife in my hand, back against a log, eyes wide. I heard movement all night, steps, snaps, faint breathing that didn't belong to me. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move between trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. By the fourth day, I was running on fumes. My water was low, my food nearly gone. My map meant nothing now. The land refused to line up with it. I followed the river until my legs nearly gave out, and that was when I saw it. A cabin. It was small, built rough, its wood dark and weathered. It sat half sunken between trees, almost hidden. Smoke didn't rise from its chimney. The windows were covered with boards. But it was real. Relief hit me first. Shelter, maybe even help. But the closer I got, the more dread seeped in. The cabin was wrong. The boards weren't just weathered. They were carved with deep marks, almost like scratches. Around the cabin, the ground was littered with bones, more than I had ever seen. Deer, maybe, but broken, piled, scattered. I stopped short. My chest tightened. Whoever lived there wasn't someone I wanted to meet. I turned back, forcing my legs to keep moving. I didn't look behind me, though I felt something following. The last night was the worst. I don't know why I decided to push deeper into the woods that day. I had camped plenty of times before, usually sticking close to marked trails and known campgrounds, but something about that trip made me want more silence, more distance between me and everything else. I had taken a week off, packed heavy with supplies, and carried a map that showed a stretch of forest with no real campsites marked, just a green mass that seemed to go on forever. I told myself I would spend a few nights out there, cut myself off, and feel what it was like to really be alone, far away from everything familiar. The first few hours of hiking weren't too bad. The trail started off as a narrow dirt path, then eventually faded into overgrown brush and uneven ground where my boots kept catching on roots. I felt the weight of my pack pressing down on my shoulders, the straps biting into my collarbone, sweat soaking my shirt, but the air smelled fresh and heavy with pine and damp earth. I liked that part. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, all I heard was the faint hum of insects, the occasional knock of a woodpecker, and the distant groan of branches moving against each other. I moved slow, watching the light shift as the day passed. The sun broke through gaps in the trees in streaks, falling across moss-covered trunks, fallen logs, and patches of mushrooms. The deeper I went, the less it felt like any place people normally walked. I didn't see any footprints or campsites, not even old fire rings. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in dead needles and leaves that swallowed the sound of my steps. It felt untouched, which was what I wanted, at least at first. By the time the sun dropped lower, I had gone farther than I planned. I kept telling myself I'd find a good flat spot to set up the tent, but the ground kept sloping down, tangled with roots or cluttered with rocks. I walked longer than I should have, and when I finally picked a spot, the light was fading fast. It was a little clearing, not wide but open enough to see the pale sky through the canopy. I dropped my pack, stretched my aching shoulders, and set up the tent in the last scraps of daylight. As I boiled water for dinner, I noticed how dark the woods got once the sun was gone. I was used to camping with the glow of nearby campfires or the faint buzz of cars on a distant road. But here, the blackness pressed right up against the edge of my camp. The trees stood tall and close, their trunks swallowed by shadow. My little fire flickered weakly, making the dark look thicker beyond it. The forest seemed to hold its breath. That first night wasn't too bad. I ate, zipped myself into the tent, and listened to the night. Every crack of a branch made me tense up, but after a while the sounds blended together. Wind brushing leaves, something small scurrying through the undergrowth, the far-off croak of frogs. My body gave out before my nerves did, and I drifted into sleep with the hum of insects buzzing in my ears. The next day, I pushed even deeper. I left my tent and gear, took a smaller pack with food and water, and followed what looked like a game trail leading downhill. The ground grew marshy, and I found a narrow stream cutting through a gully. I knelt down, splashed my face, and drank from the filter bottle. The water was cold and sharp, the kind that tastes almost metallic from the minerals. I sat there a while, just breathing, enjoying how still it was. But as I sat, I noticed something that didn't fit. Across the stream, the ground looked trampled. Not just a little, but as if something heavy had been through over and over, crushing plants flat and leaving dark, wet patches in the soil. At first, I thought it was where deer had crossed, but the ground looked too torn up. The marks were wide, not hoof-shaped. I stepped closer, squinting, trying to make sense of the pattern. The longer I looked, the less it seemed like animals. It almost looked like someone had been dragging something heavy through the mud. I stood there a long time, just staring, my brain trying to settle on an explanation. Maybe hunters, maybe a fallen branch pulled across. I told myself not to think too much and turned back, but the image of that ground stuck with me. That evening, back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I cooked, cleaned up, and sat by the fire, but I kept glancing into the trees. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every shift in the leaves felt too close. At one point, I thought I heard a snapping sound, like a footstep, but when I stood and held my flashlight toward it, all I saw was tangled brush. I slept badly that night. My ears stayed awake even when my eyes closed. Twice I jolted up, heart hammering, sure I'd heard something outside the tent. The second time, I pressed my ear against the fabric and held my breath. For a moment, I swore I heard movement, slow and steady, like someone walking just past the edge of the clearing. Not running, not rushing, just moving. I waited, every muscle tense, until silence came back. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour before my body gave in. In the morning, I stepped out into gray light. The clearing looked the same, but something felt off. I walked the edge, checking the ground, and that's when I saw it, mud pressed down into the shape of a boot print. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, wider, deeper. Someone had been near my tent in the night. My stomach sank. The woods were supposed to be empty. No trails, no campsites, no reason for anyone to wander this far. I tried to convince myself it was an old print, maybe left weeks ago, but the mud was still dark and damp. It looked fresh. I packed up fast. My hands shook as I stuffed gear into the pack. I wanted to head back the way I came, but the problem was, I'd gone so far off trail that I wasn't even sure where the trail was anymore. I had a compass, a map, and a general sense of direction, so I told myself I'd just backtrack uphill and eventually hit something familiar. As I hiked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different now. What had been peaceful silence now felt like a trap. Every crow call made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves made me snap my head around. My pace was too fast, sweat pouring down my back, lungs burning. Around midday, I stopped to rest, leaning against a tree, and that's when I saw it again. Another trampled patch of ground. Branches snapped low, bark scraped. This time, no doubt, someone had been through. And not long ago. The marks were too fresh. I didn't eat. I didn't even drink water. I just pushed harder, stumbling over roots, climbing steep slopes, trying to find my way out. But the woods twisted on themselves. Every ridge looked like the last, every hollow filled with the same moss and ferns. By late afternoon, my legs ached, and panic sat heavy in my chest. I finally stopped near a fallen log to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. Something stuck into the bark of a tree a few feet away. I walked closer, and my skin went cold. It was a piece of cloth, torn and snagged on the rough wood. Not old, not weathered, fresh. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my throat. Someone else was out here, moving through the same stretch of woods. And from the look of the torn edge, it hadn't been long. The sun started dropping fast, shadows crawling back over the ground. I knew I couldn't keep moving in the dark, not with the way the forest twisted. So I forced myself to set up camp again, though everything in me screamed to keep going. I built the smallest fire I could, barely enough to see by, and sat with my back against a tree, knife in my lap. The night dragged on. Every sound made me flinch. At one point, I heard the faint crack of a branch snapping. Not far, maybe 20 yards. My chest locked tight. I held the knife hard enough to hurt my hand, staring into the dark until my eyes burned. Eventually, silence came again, but I didn't sleep at all. When the first gray light came, I didn't bother cooking or packing properly. I just shoved everything into my bag and started moving. My body felt weak, but fear kept me going. I kept my eyes on the ground, looking for any sign of the trail, anything to lead me out. By midday, my legs were shaking. I stumbled into a small gully and froze. In the mud, clear as day, were footprints. Not mine, not animal, human. The tread matched the one I saw by my camp. The prints were deep, fresh, and leading the same direction I was going. My stomach dropped. I wasn't just lost in the woods. Someone else was out here, moving ahead of me, maybe watching, maybe waiting. I stopped, listening hard. The forest was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I thought about turning, going another direction, but I didn't know where another direction even was anymore. So I kept going, following the prints, because at least they meant I wasn't circling back on myself. The prints led uphill, through thicker brush, until I broke out onto a ridge. From there, I finally saw it. A faint line, almost hidden under leaves and needles. A trail. Not wide, not official, but clear enough to follow. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I hurried down it, stumbling, branches clawing at my arms. My only thought was to get out, to find a road. I never liked how quiet the deep woods could get. On the surface, it seemed peaceful, the kind of silence that people called calm. But the longer I stayed in it, the more that silence pressed against me like something heavy. I went out there alone, a late summer trip, trying to get away from everything. I wanted space. I wanted the air to feel clean. I wanted to walk far enough from roads and power lines that I couldn't hear the hum of traffic or see the faint glow of towns. I packed a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cheap gas stove, and enough food for 5 days. The trail I started on wasn't popular, and I went farther than most hikers did, cutting deeper into the forest where the ground turned uneven and the trees grew so thick their branches locked above me. I told myself it was what I wanted, real wilderness, not just the easy kind where you could hear kids on bikes in the distance. The first day passed smooth enough. I followed a river upstream, filling my bottle when I needed. The water was cold, clear, and moved fast over slick rocks. The air smelled like pine sap and damp soil. I saw deer once, far ahead, moving quick into the trees when they caught my scent. I remember thinking how good it felt to be away from people, just me and the woods. By evening, I set up camp in a flat clearing near the river. I boiled rice and canned meat, ate while the light drained out of the sky, and laid down early, my body heavy from the long hike. The second day, I kept pushing deeper. The trail had faded into little more than deer paths, but I didn't care. My map showed thick woods stretching out for miles. That was the point. I wanted to be swallowed by it. But something changed by midday. The deeper I went, the stranger the woods felt. The ground dipped and rose without warning. The air grew damp and stale, and the light barely cut through the branches above. The river curved away and left me, and suddenly it was just endless trees with no sound but my own boots crushing twigs and the occasional bird snapping away. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I told myself I could handle it. I kept going until I found another clearing, smaller than the first, and set my tent there. That night I noticed how dark it got. I mean, real dark. So dark I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face unless I lit my headlamp. I laid in the tent, hearing nothing outside, and realized that the quiet I had wanted so badly now felt wrong. My ears strained, waiting for something, anything. Normally in the woods you hear crickets, owls, wind. Out there, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I woke sometime in the night to a crunch. A single step outside. My heart slammed against my chest. I held my breath and waited, thinking maybe it was a branch falling, maybe a deer nosing near the camp. But I didn't hear it again. After 10 minutes of frozen stillness, I finally let my body relax, but I didn't sleep well again. The third day I went farther in, stubborn, even though I knew I should have been working my way out. I kept thinking I wanted to see something different, maybe a hidden lake or an old logging road, something that made the effort worth it. Instead, the woods grew thicker, harder to walk through, the underbrush clawing at my legs. The ground sucked at my boots in places, soft mud hiding beneath a carpet of leaves. Around midday, I found signs I wasn't alone. A tree, its bark stripped off in a clean vertical line higher than I could reach. Not from deer. I stopped, staring at it, and thought of bears. The cut looked fresh. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but I couldn't stop looking around, checking shadows between trees. The silence pressed harder. That night, I set up camp on a slope because I couldn't find anywhere flat. I ate quickly, zipped into the tent, and sat in the dark with my lamp off. Again, the woods gave me nothing back. No wind, no rustle, no trickle of water. Just that thick silence, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I fell into uneasy sleep. The sound that woke me this time wasn't a crunch. It was softer, slower, almost careful. Leaves shifting one after another. Something moving but not rushing. I froze in my sleeping bag. My mouth went dry and every muscle locked. The sound circled, first to the left of the tent, then behind it, then in front. I pictured a bear nosing around, but it wasn't loud enough. Bears move heavy. This was quieter, steadier. The steps stopped near the tent entrance. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The seconds dragged so long I thought I might suffocate. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound drifted away, soft steps fading until I couldn't hear them. I stayed frozen until dawn broke. The morning light didn't bring relief. My nerves felt raw, my body heavy. I packed up fast, barely eating, and told myself I needed to head back. But the problem was I had pushed so far in, I wasn't sure which way was best. My map didn't match the land anymore. The woods twisted in ways it shouldn't have, paths doubling back, slopes rising where the paper said they shouldn't. I picked the direction I thought was right and went. By afternoon, I realized I was wrong. The woods didn't open up, they only pressed tighter, the trees leaning in close like they were swallowing me. My legs burned from climbing ridges that went nowhere. Sweat soaked my shirt. I couldn't find the river I had followed in, couldn't hear anything that told me where it might be. Every direction looked the same. That night, I didn't even bother cooking. I set up the tent in the least sloped ground I could find, zipped myself inside, and laid there staring at the thin nylon wall. My headlamp battery was low, so I left it off, but the dark crushed me. I couldn't stop remembering the sounds from the night before. I kept thinking about those careful steps, how slow they had been, how patient. Came again. Later, when the woods were at their deepest quiet, I heard it. A slow shuffle of leaves. A step, then another. I thought maybe my brain was making it up. But no, the pattern was the same, steady, circling. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making sound. My skin prickled with sweat, my chest tight. The steps moved around the tent, stopping sometimes like whoever or whatever, it was just stood there listening. At one point, something brushed the tent wall, just the faintest drag across the fabric. My heart hammered so hard I thought the sound would give me away. Then the steps faded again, slow into nothing. I didn't sleep, not a second. When daylight came, I grabbed everything and moved. I didn't even pack the tent right, just stuffed it, shaking, into my bag. I pushed hard all day, stumbling over roots, cutting through brush, scratching my arms and face. My throat was dry, my food running low. I started to feel dizzy, the air thick. That afternoon, I found something that stopped me cold. A fire ring. Stones stacked in a rough circle, black char in the middle, old but not ancient. Someone had camped there, but it didn't feel right. The stones were big, heavy, dragged from far away. Around them, the ground was trampled, the leaves pressed down. I crouched, staring, trying to see how long ago it had been used. Not yesterday, but not years either. I backed away from it, my skin crawling. That night, I forced myself to stay awake. I propped myself against a tree, gripping my knife, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. My head kept snapping down as I dozed, jerking back up at the faintest sound. Came again. The steps. Careful, patient, circling. I gripped the knife until my hand cramped. My chest ached with each shallow breath. I thought maybe I saw something between the trees. A shape, a shadow thicker than the rest. But it was too dark, my eyes too tired. I lasted like that until the faint gray of dawn touched the trees. Then I ran. I don't even know if I picked a direction. I just ran, crashing through brush, stumbling, falling, getting up again. Hours passed. My water ran out. My stomach ached with hunger. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I would see someone there. By afternoon, I found the river, the same one I had followed at the start. Relief hit me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I filled my bottle, drank until my stomach cramped, then followed it downstream. I knew it would eventually take me back. I kept going, pushing through exhaustion. Every sound in the woods made me snap my head around. I didn't stop. I walked until night, then forced myself another hour by headlamp before I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even set up the tent. I woke in the dark to the sound again. Closer this time, not circling, coming straight toward me. I jumped up, my body screaming from exhaustion, and ran. I left half my gear, didn't even look back. Branches whipped my face, roots caught my boots, but I kept going. The sound followed, soft, steady, never rushing, but never stopping. Hours later, when the sky lightened again, I stumbled onto the faint line of a real trail. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I followed it, limping, every muscle ready to give. By midday, I reached a dirt road, and not long after that, I never liked how quiet the woods could get when you were far enough in. At first it felt peaceful, like the silence itself was a kind of comfort, but the deeper you went, the less natural it felt. The quiet pressed down in a way that made every little sound stand out, like the crunch of leaves under my boots, the brush of my pack straps against my jacket, the snap of a twig that always made me freeze for a second and glance around. I had always liked hiking, and I had camped plenty of times before, but this time I had decided to go deeper into the woods than I normally did, far past the trails that most people bothered with. I had no plan for company, no marked campground waiting for me, just a map with penciled notes, a heavy pack, and the idea that I would go as far as I could and spend the night out there. The first few miles were fine. The air smelled clean and damp, like moss and wet soil. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a creek, the hum of insects that rose and fell as I moved along. I kept track of my location carefully, noting landmarks, but as the trees thickened, everything began to look the same. Tall trunks, dense underbrush, the forest floor soft with needles and leaves. I pushed through brambles, skirted around fallen logs, and kept moving deeper and deeper until the woods around me didn't feel like the kind of place people went anymore. The sun filtered through the canopy in patches, but the deeper I went, the less light seemed to reach the ground. Shadows gathered in hollows, and the trees blocked out the horizon so that all I could see were trunks and brush stretching endlessly in every direction. I had the sense that I was walking into something that didn't want me there, even though I knew that was just nerves. I stopped around late afternoon and set up camp in a small clearing. I cleared away leaves, set up my small tent, and made sure I had enough dry wood stacked for a fire. When the fire was lit, the crackle and heat made me feel better. The little circle of light pushed back the shadows, and I told myself it was fine, that I just wasn't used to being this far in alone. I ate from a small tin of beans, drank water from my bottle, and tried to relax, listening to the forest settle down for the night. But the quiet was wrong. Normally, in the woods, even at night, there are sounds. Insects, frogs, owls. But as darkness thickened, the woods went dead still, like everything had shut itself down. No chirps, no croaks, not even the faint buzz of flies. Just silence, broken only by the fire popping or a distant crack, sharp and sudden, like something heavy stepping on a branch. I froze every time I heard it. My fire burned bright, but beyond the glow, everything was pitch black. My eyes strained at the darkness, but I couldn't see past the first row of trees. Each crack of wood, each faint shuffle in the brush, seemed closer than the last. I sat up most of the night, staring into the dark, my hand tight on the flashlight I had ready at my side. Every now and then I would sweep it across the trees, but the beam lit up nothing more than rough bark, low shrubs, and drifting mist that was beginning to creep in. When morning finally came, I felt wrung out. My body was stiff, my eyes heavy, but I packed up quickly. I didn't want to stay there. I didn't even want to cook breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack and started moving, pushing hard to get back toward familiar ground. But the forest didn't seem to open up. The more I walked, the more I realized I wasn't seeing anything I recognized. The trees all looked the same, the ground uneven, choked with roots and wet moss. I checked my compass and tried to follow the direction that should have led me out, but no matter how long I walked, I didn't see any sign of the trail. By midday, the air had grown hotter and heavy, the sun barely reaching the ground through the thick canopy. I could hear water somewhere and tried to head toward it, thinking I might find the creek I had crossed earlier. I followed the sound until I reached a small stream winding between rocks, its water running clear. I crouched, filled my bottle, and splashed my face, but as I drank, I noticed something in the mud along the bank. Prints. Not animal prints. Shoe prints. At first I felt relief. Someone else had been out here, maybe not recently, but it meant I wasn't completely alone in this stretch of forest. But as I studied them, something about the tracks unsettled me. They were deep, like whoever made them had been carrying a lot of weight, and they weren't fresh. The edges were soft, weathered, maybe a few days old. There were no others leading back the way I came. No sign of where the person had gone next, just a cluster of heavy prints in the mud that seemed to stop at the edge of the stream. I followed the stream for hours, thinking maybe it would lead me somewhere. Another trail, maybe a road, but the woods only grew thicker. Branches clawed at my arms, the ground turned soft and sucked at my boots, and I kept catching faint smells that didn't belong. Faint smoke or something sour, rotting. When night started to fall again, panic scraped at the back of my mind. I hadn't eaten more than a handful of jerky since the night before, and my water was almost gone. I found another clearing, smaller than the first, and built another fire. But this time I felt exposed. The trees pressed in close, the underbrush thick, and the firelight seemed to throw more shadows than it chased away. That night, the noises came again. Not just cracks this time, rustles. Shifts in the brush, low and steady, like something moving around me in the dark. My skin crawled as I listened, every muscle tense, my eyes darting to the shadows. I thought about shouting, about making some noise to scare off whatever it was, but I couldn't bring myself to. My throat felt locked tight, my breath shallow, as I sat frozen, watching, listening. Hours passed like that, the sounds circling, moving closer, then fading, then closer again. I could picture something just out of sight, pacing around my camp, staying just far enough away that the firelight wouldn't touch it. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a shape shifting in the dark, but when I aimed my flashlight, there was nothing there. By morning, I was shaking with exhaustion. My fire had burned down to embers, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I packed up again, my hands clumsy, my mind thick with fatigue, and started moving. The stream was gone now, lost behind me, and I stumbled through the brush, barely keeping track of direction. That day felt endless. The forest didn't change. No matter how far I walked, it looked the same. The same tall trunks, the same thick brush, the same patches of moss. I began to feel like I wasn't getting anywhere at all, like I was walking in circles even though my compass said otherwise. Hunger gnawed at me, my legs ached, and my lips felt dry and cracked. Late in the afternoon, I came across something that froze me in place. In a hollow between the trees, half hidden under brush, was a pile of bones. Deer, I thought at first, but as I stepped closer, I realized some of them weren't animal. A rib cage, small but human. A piece of a skull, half buried in leaves. The bones were old, bleached and weathered, scattered like they had been pulled apart. My chest tightened, my pulse hammering. I stumbled back, my eyes darting into the trees, expecting to see something watching me. The silence was so heavy it pressed in on my ears, broken only by the thud of my heart. I backed away, turned, and pushed myself into a run, crashing through brush, tripping on roots, desperate to get as far from that place as I could. When I finally stopped, gasping, sweat pouring down my face, the forest around me was still the same. No sign of a trail, no sign of escape, just trees in every direction. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I was too afraid it would draw attention. I huddled under my tarp, the dark pressing in, every sound amplified. I could hear footsteps again, slow, steady, circling, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. I buried my face against my knees, trying not to make a sound, every muscle locked. At one point, I thought I heard breathing low and steady, just beyond the thin fabric of my shelter. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. When dawn came, pale and gray, I uncurled myself, my body aching. My tarp was damp with dew, my pack half unzipped though I swore I had closed it the night before. My food bag was gone, all of it, every last bit. My heart pounded as I searched the ground, but there were no prints, no signs of where it had gone, just gone. I knew then that I couldn't last much longer. Without food, without water, I would collapse out here. I forced myself up, forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt heavier. The woods blurred around me, the trees tilting, the ground uneven. I fell more than once, scraping my palms, tearing my pants, but I kept pushing. By evening, I was barely walking. My vision swam, my legs shook, but then, through the trees, I saw something, a shape, not another tree, not brush, a structure, a cabin. I stumbled toward it, my chest. I had been planning that camping trip for weeks. The idea was simple: get away from the noise, the constant mess of daily life, and put myself somewhere quiet. I didn't want people, I didn't want cars, I didn't even want trails full of hikers. I wanted isolation, the kind of silence you only get when you are deep enough in the woods that even your phone gives up trying to find a signal. I packed light but carefully. I brought a good tent, a sleeping bag that could handle cool nights, a small camp stove, a water filter, a decent amount of food, and a small hatchet. I carried a first aid kit, extra socks, and a headlamp with new batteries. I wasn't careless. I had camped before, though not this deep and not this far alone. The place I picked wasn't on a popular map. I had studied satellite views online and saw a wide stretch of forestland with no cabins, no signs of development. I wanted to push past where most hikers stop. When I arrived, the parking area was empty. There was a small wooden sign showing the main trail, but I had no interest in staying on it for long. I crossed into the trees with my pack on my back and my boots breaking through the soft soil and layers of pine needles. The air smelled like wet bark and moss. It was still early in the day, the sun not yet at its highest, and I felt good as I moved in deeper. The forest was quiet in a way that made me pay attention to every sound. A distant woodpecker hammered somewhere. Squirrels darted across branches above me. The ground rose and fell, small ridges and dips that made the walk uneven. I followed the trail for a while, but soon I stepped off into the unmarked woods. I wanted no chance of running into anyone. After about 2 hours of steady walking, I found a small clearing that felt perfect. It wasn't wide open, but the trees thinned just enough to let sunlight reach the ground. The soil was flat, dry, and soft enough to stake my tent. To one side, I noticed the faint trickle of water, and after checking, I found a small creek running clear and cold. That was a lucky spot. Fresh water without having to carry gallons of it on my back. I set up my tent slowly, making sure each stake went deep into the ground. The tent looked solid once it stood. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and placed my pack against one wall. After that, I gathered some fallen branches and made a small fire pit with rocks. Took time to get it going, but soon I had a low flame burning. I heated water and made instant noodles, sitting on a log and eating while the forest shifted into late afternoon. It should have felt peaceful, but there was something about that silence that kept me on edge. When the fire crackled down, I felt every sound behind me, like I was being reminded that this was not my space. The forest belonged to itself, and I was just a visitor. I told myself that was part of the point. I wanted to feel cut off, to remind myself what it was like to sit alone where no one could reach me. That night, after crawling into my sleeping bag, I noticed the forest sounds shift. At first, it was crickets and frogs. Then it was nothing, a heavy kind of silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I lay on my back, staring at the thin nylon wall of the tent, my ears sharp for every faint sound. I heard the creek gurgling faintly. Then, much later, I thought I heard something heavier. A crunch of leaves, a slow step, then another. My body tensed up. It didn't sound close at first, but it was steady, deliberate. Not a rabbit or a squirrel. Something bigger. I held my breath, listening as the sound passed beyond the tent and faded. I told myself it could be a deer. This was their territory. Still, I gripped my small hatchet and kept it close until sleep finally dragged me under. The morning felt normal again. The light came through the fabric of the tent, pale and soft. I unzipped the door and the cool air hit my face. Birds had returned, chirping everywhere. I boiled water, made coffee, and ate a granola bar. The tension of the night faded as the forest warmed back to life. I filled my water bottles from the creek using the filter, then decided to explore further. I left my pack at camp and carried only the essentials: knife, map, compass, and water. Walking deeper into the woods, I noticed how dense the trees became. Branches tangled above me, dimming the light. The ground was uneven, scattered with fallen logs and thick brush. After a while, I came across an old structure, half hidden by vines. It looked like what was left of a hunting shack. The wood was gray and rotten, the roof partly collapsed. I stepped closer, but didn't go inside. The air around it smelled strange, like mold and something sour. I didn't want to touch it. I walked a wide circle around and kept moving. By the time I returned to camp, it was mid-afternoon. I rested, cooked some rice, and sat by the creek. But something was wrong. I noticed the ground near the edge of the clearing looked disturbed. The soil was freshly turned, like something heavy had pressed into it. A single print caught my eye deep and clear. It was a boot print, not mine. It was larger, wider, and pointed in the direction of my camp. My chest tightened. Someone else had been here. I looked around quickly, scanning the trees, the brush, every shadow. Nothing moved, but the thought of someone standing near my camp while I was gone set every nerve on fire. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe it was old, but the print was too sharp, too recent. The edges hadn't softened. Whoever made it was here today, maybe while I was out. The rest of that day, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the tree line, listening for movement. When the sun dipped and the shadows stretched, I debated packing up and hiking back to the trail, but it was already late. I decided I would stay one more night, but I wouldn't sleep deeply. I would be ready. As darkness settled, I built the fire bigger than before. The flames pushed against the shadows, but the trees pressed close like walls. I sat with my back to my tent, watching the woods. Hours went by. My fire dropped low, just glowing coals, and I heard it again. A slow crunch, then another. This time closer. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The sound came from the trees beyond the creek. I gripped my hatchet and froze, barely breathing. Something moved in the dark. Not an animal. The steps were careful, spaced apart, almost testing the ground. My firelight only reached so far, and the figure stayed just beyond it. I thought I saw a shape, a darker shadow among shadows, standing still, watching. My throat went dry. Whoever it was, they didn't speak, didn't move closer. They just waited. I sat like that for what felt like forever, my eyes burning from trying to focus. At last, the figure shifted back, the sound of steps fading into the woods. I stayed awake until morning, too afraid to close my eyes. When the light returned, I packed fast. I stuffed my sleeping bag, tore down the tent, shoved everything into my pack with clumsy hands. My only thought was to get out. But when I stepped to the edge of the clearing, I stopped cold. Another print waited in the soft dirt, fresh, deeper than the one before. The tread was sharp. Whoever it was had been standing right there, watching my camp in the night. I didn't waste another second. I slung my pack and started moving, fast, back the way I had come. My compass pointed me west, back toward the trailhead. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop for water. I felt eyes on me the whole time, though I never turned to look. The forest that had felt so open now pressed in on all sides. Every crack of a branch behind me made me jump. By late afternoon, I reached the main trail again. Relief almost dropped me to my knees. From there, I followed it straight out until I saw my car sitting alone in the lot. I threw my pack inside, got behind the wheel, and drove without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. No one would have believed me anyway. To them, it would have sounded like nerves or imagination. But I know what I saw. I know those prints were real. Someone else was out there, deep in the woods, watching. They never approached, never spoke, never made a move while I was awake. They just stood where the firelight couldn't reach, waiting for the moment I wasn't ready. I haven't gone back since. I still think about that shadow outside the fire, about the weight of those steps in the soil. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. / I never liked the idea of being deep in the woods alone, but I kept pushing myself to try it because I thought it would make me tougher. I always believed that the quiet of the forest and the raw exposure to nature would teach me something about myself, that if I went far enough and stayed long enough, I would come out stronger. Most times I camped close to trails, close to other people, where I could hear distant voices or see smoke from someone else's fire through the trees. This time, though, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to push myself far past where anyone else went. I studied a map for days, circling a place that was several miles past the marked trails, deep in a patch of woods that didn't have any campsites or fire rings or signs of anyone. It looked like a stretch of thick forest with no roads or houses for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me, the trees, and whatever lived out there. I left early in the morning with my backpack heavier than usual. I packed food, water filters, a small hatchet, my tent, sleeping bag, and everything I thought I would need for at least 4 days. I hiked along the trail until it thinned and then disappeared. From there, I pushed forward into the trees, trying to keep my direction straight using the compass. The forest grew thicker, the ground uneven, filled with roots, fallen branches, and rocks hidden under leaves. I liked the challenge at first. Every step deeper made me feel like I was leaving the world behind. Hours went by without any sign of another person. The air felt heavier, cooler, and damp. The light barely cut through the tall pines and thick undergrowth. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a slope that dropped into a creek bed. I decided that would be my camp. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and made a small fire before darkness settled in. The first night was uneasy. The woods had a way of coming alive when the sun dropped. I could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching, small animals moving. I told myself it was normal: raccoons, deer, maybe a fox. Still, the sounds pressed against the thin fabric of the tent and made me feel exposed. I kept my hatchet close, even when I lay down. By morning, nothing seemed wrong. The fire had burned down to ash, and the forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. I boiled some water, ate, and decided to explore further around camp. The creek below looked shallow, with black water moving slowly under branches that had fallen across it. I followed it for a while, thinking maybe I could fish if I saw anything. But the water looked empty. The mud around it showed prints I couldn't place. Maybe deer, maybe something else. The more I stared, the less they looked like anything I knew. Long, uneven, almost like someone had stepped there barefoot but dragging their heel. I shook it off and went back to camp. Most of the day I spent gathering wood and making sure I had enough to keep a fire going at night. But I kept feeling like I wasn't alone out there. The hairs on my arms stood up for no reason sometimes, like something was watching me. I told myself it was just nerves from being so far out, but it didn't fade. The second night was worse. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I heard something bigger than a raccoon move through the brush near my tent. Heavy steps, not quick like an animal, but slow, careful. My heart pounded as I held the hatchet tight in my hand. I didn't move or breathe loud. The steps circled once, then faded back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. When morning came, I walked around camp looking for signs. I found impressions in the soft dirt, not clear enough to call footprints, but big and not shaped like hooves or paws. The ground was too dry in most places to hold detail, but what I saw made my stomach sink. Someone else had been near my tent in the night. I thought about packing up, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe my mind was twisting normal signs into something else. I forced myself to stay. I gathered more wood, fished again, and tried to keep busy, but my eyes kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. That night, I built the fire higher. The flames jumped and cracked, but the light only pushed back so far. Beyond the fire, the woods were pure black. The silence was thick. Hours passed, and then I heard it again. Slow steps moving around the edge of the firelight. I couldn't see who or what it was, but I could hear them. They stopped when I stood. I gripped the hatchet and stared into the dark. Nothing moved. I barely blinked, afraid I'd miss something. The steps picked up again, faint, moving away. I stayed by the fire all night. I didn't even try to sleep. My nerves were shot, my hands shaking. By morning, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, barely eating. I wanted to get out before night came again. I followed my compass back toward the trail, but the deeper I went, the less sure I felt. The trees all looked the same. The ground twisted me around. After a few hours, I wasn't sure if I was heading the right way anymore. I tried to stay calm, to trust the compass, but a sick feeling built in my gut. By late afternoon, I realized I had circled. I saw the same creek again, the same fallen log across it. My heart sank. I had wasted hours and ended up right back where I started. Worse, I saw something new. Near the log, in the mud, were clear footprints this time. Human, barefoot. The toes were spread, the heels dug deep. They weren't mine. I hadn't crossed here before. Whoever had walked there was close. I backed away, every sound in the forest suddenly sharp. I kept moving, forcing myself not to run, even though my body wanted to. I set up camp again before dark, too tired to keep going. This time I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food, crawled into the tent, and waited. The night dragged on forever. Every snap outside made my chest tighten. At some point, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, just beyond the thin wall of the tent. My body froze. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand hurt. The breathing stayed for what felt like hours, then faded. I didn't move until the sky lightened. The next day, I barely thought. I just walked, following the compass, fighting through brush, stumbling over roots, desperate to find the trail again. My clothes were torn, my arms scratched, my throat dry. By midday, I heard something behind me, not close but following. I sped up, crashing through the trees, but the sounds followed. Every time I stopped, the forest went silent. When I moved again, the sounds picked up. I didn't know how long I could keep going. My legs shook. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I dropped it finally, keeping only water and the hatchet. I forced myself to run, branches whipping my face, lungs burning. At last, through the trees, I saw a strip of dirt, the trail. I stumbled onto it, dropping to my knees. Relief washed over me so hard I almost cried. But when I turned back, I saw the trees swaying. Something was there, just inside the dark. Not an animal, a shape standing still, watching. I couldn't make out the face, but I knew it was a man. Barefoot, silent, waiting. I didn't go back for the pack. I didn't stop running until the parking lot was in sight, my car still there. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove until the forest was miles behind me. Even now, safe at home, I can't shake it. The thought that someone lives out there, deep in the woods, far past where people go. Someone who doesn't want to be found, who moves through the trees like they belong there more than I ever could. I don't know if he followed me all those nights or if there are more of them out there. All I know is that when I lay down at night, I hear the same slow breathing outside my door, and I wonder if leaving the forest really means I ever escaped. I had always liked the woods. Growing up, I spent more time outside than inside, and I thought I understood what the forest really was. I thought I knew what it meant to be alone in the trees, away from people, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the branches and the smell of pine and dirt in the air. But the trip I made deep into the woods that fall showed me how little I understood, and how quickly the forest could turn into something that stripped you of every bit of comfort you thought you had. Started out like any normal hiking trip. I picked a weekend in late September when the weather was just starting to turn cool. The leaves were changing, but they weren't all down yet, so the forest floor was still open enough to walk without sinking into thick piles of dry leaves. I had marked a spot on a map where an old logging road cut deep into the backcountry. I figured I'd follow it for a day, then camp off trail, away from where most people went. I liked the idea of being far enough out that I wouldn't see another person. I carried a pack with 2 days of food, a tent, a sleeping bag, and all the small things I usually brought: knife, flashlight, compass, water filter. It was a simple trip, one I had done in different forms many times before. The logging road was rough but easy to follow. It was overgrown with weeds and saplings. The dirt track faded into something that looked more like a long scar through the trees than a real path. The further I went, the less it looked like a road at all. The branches leaned over it, grasses grew waist-high in places, and the ruts had filled with moss. It was clear no trucks had used it for decades. That was exactly what I wanted. I walked all morning with no trouble. The air was cool, and a light breeze pushed through the trees. Squirrels ran in the leaves, a few birds called now and then, and I felt completely at peace. Around noon, I stopped to eat, just sitting on a rock beside the overgrown road, letting the forest be as quiet as it wanted. There were no signs of people anywhere. I hadn't seen a candy wrapper, a cut tree, or even a boot print. That gave me a strange kind of pride. It felt like I had pushed far enough in to be where no one really bothered to go. By the afternoon, the road dipped into a hollow and began climbing again, twisting as it went. The trees grew thicker there, darker. Pines crowded close together, their needles damp underfoot. The road turned into little more than a suggestion, but I kept following it until the shadows stretched long and I knew I needed to find a place to camp. I left the road and walked uphill, searching for flat ground. After 20 minutes, I found a small clearing barely big enough to set up my tent. The ground was soft, a mix of pine needles and dry soil. I dropped my pack, stretched, and started putting up camp. Everything felt normal, routine. I cooked a simple meal on my little stove as the sun dipped, and when the air cooled further, I crawled into my sleeping bag and lay listening to the sounds of the woods as night settled. That was when I first noticed how different the forest sounded out there. Back near towns or popular trails, the woods always had background noise. Distant cars, airplanes, maybe even voices. But here, it was nothing but the forest. At first, there were crickets and a few birds settling down. Then, slowly, as the dark thickened, even those faded. The silence became almost complete. I had been in quiet woods before, but this was different. It was so total that I could hear my own heartbeat and the ringing in my ears. I tried to ignore it, tried to enjoy the kind of quiet that was hard to find anywhere else. But lying in that tent, I felt an unease creep in. The trees seemed to press closer. Every small snap outside became sharp, carrying too far in the silence. I told myself it was just normal night noises, branches dropping, maybe a raccoon. Still, I didn't sleep well. I drifted in and out, waking often, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. At some point deep in the night, I woke again, but this time it wasn't from silence. It was from sound. Faint, very faint, but clear enough that I knew I hadn't dreamed it. It was the crunch of something moving through the leaves. Slow, deliberate steps, not the skittering of a squirrel or the fast scamper of a raccoon. Heavier, more measured. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears. The steps came again, then stopped. I couldn't tell how close. Sound was strange in the forest. Could have been 20 feet away or 100. I reached slowly for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just lay there, gripping it, listening. After what felt like minutes of stillness, the sound came again. A few more steps, then another pause. My throat was dry. My heartbeat felt too loud. I thought about calling out, but the words stuck. Something about the way the steps came didn't feel like another camper or hiker. Nobody would be walking around out here at that hour, not this far in. The steps stopped again, and this time they didn't start back up. I lay there for what felt like an hour, my muscles tight, every sound in the woods magnified. Eventually, either the thing moved off or I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When dawn came, I crawled out of the tent and looked around. The clearing looked the same as before. My gear was untouched, but when I stepped to the edge and looked down the slope, I saw faint impressions in the ground. The soil was soft enough that something had pressed into it. Not sharp prints, nothing I could identify for sure, but enough to see that something heavy had passed through not long ago. I told myself it was probably a deer, big enough to sound heavy, curious enough to move slow. That made sense, but it didn't erase the way those steps had felt. Like something choosing where to put each foot, pausing to listen. I pushed the thought down and packed up camp. I decided to keep moving deeper. Part of me thought about turning back, but I didn't want to. I told myself I wasn't going to let a noise in the night ruin a trip I'd planned for weeks. So I walked. The logging road grew harder to follow. In some places I lost it completely and had to pick it up again by looking for the faint line of younger trees that had filled in the old cut. The further I went, the wilder it felt. Fallen logs blocked the way, thorn bushes grabbed at my clothes, and the ground sloped into gullies and ridges that twisted me around. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't made much distance. My legs were tired from climbing over down trees and weaving through brush. I looked at the map and knew I was well off the marked trails, well into the kind of country people didn't come without a reason. I found another spot to camp just as the light started to fade. This one was even smaller, just a flat patch beside a huge fallen pine. I set up quickly, ate, and settled in. Again, as night fell, the woods grew painfully quiet. I tried to distract myself, reading a little from a small book I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. The silence pressed on me. I clicked off the light and lay down, waiting for sleep. And again, sometime deep in the night, I woke to footsteps. This time I was certain. They were closer, circling. Slow, steady. moving through the leaves just beyond the edge of the clearing. My skin crawled. I didn't move. My flashlight sat by my hand again, but I didn't switch it on. Whoever or whatever, it seemed to stop when I stirred, as if it knew I was listening. The steps would go a few yards, then pause. Go again, then stop. I lay there frozen, my mind racing through explanations. A bear? Maybe, but the steps seemed too careful, too deliberate. Person? If it was, why? Nobody had any reason to be out there at that hour, and certainly not sneaking around someone else's camp. The circling went on for what felt like forever. Finally, after a long stretch of silence, exhaustion pulled me under again. In the gray light of morning, I checked. This time, the impressions in the soil were clearer. Not boots, not hooves, not paws. Just vague, broad shapes pressed into the earth. Too heavy for a raccoon, too wide for a deer. I crouched there staring at them, my stomach tightening. I should have turned back then. Every part of me knew it, but stubbornness and pride kept me moving. I told myself I was imagining things, that if I left now, I'd regret cutting the trip short. So I went deeper still. The third day was harder. My legs ached, and the forest seemed to fight me more with every step. The old road was gone now, nothing but wild ground. I pushed through thick stands of spruce, crossed a stream on slippery rocks, and climbed a ridge that seemed to go on forever. When I reached the top, the view showed nothing but endless trees in every direction. No sign of roads, houses, or people. That should have felt freeing, but instead it filled me with dread. I realized just how far I had gone, how alone I really was. If something went wrong, there was nobody to help. Nobody would even know where to start looking. That night, camped on the ridge, I didn't sleep at all. The footsteps came again, but this time they didn't circle. They came closer. I heard the brush shift, the scrape of something against bark. At one point, I swear I heard breathing slow, heavy, just outside the thin wall of my tent. I gripped my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, barely daring to breathe. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. Work had drained me, city noise had worn me down, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the woods for a few days where no one could bother me. I picked a place called Random Lake. The name sounded odd, almost like it was made up, but when I saw the pictures online, it looked quiet and untouched. Not many people seemed to go there, which made it even more appealing. I packed up my small tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, some food, a flashlight, and my knife. I wanted to travel light since I'd be hiking in about 5 miles to the lake. I left my car parked on the side of the gravel road, strapped my backpack tight, and started down the trail. The trail was overgrown in places, with weeds pushing through the dirt path, but the air smelled clean. Pine needles covered the ground, and the wind made a soft whistle through the branches above me. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The hum of the road faded behind me until all I could hear was my boots hitting dirt and the occasional cry of a bird. I liked that silence. It felt like the world had gone still just for me. When I finally reached the lake, I understood why so few people came here. The water was dark and still, with tall trees crowding all around it. The shoreline was narrow, with only a couple of flat spots where someone could set up a tent. There was no sign of other campers, no fire rings, no trash, no footprints in the dirt. Just me, the lake, and the trees. I picked a spot close to the water but still sheltered by trees. The ground there was soft with pine needles, and the view of the lake was wide and clear. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and began to set up camp. The tent went up easily, and I laid my sleeping bag inside. I boiled some water on the stove, made instant noodles, and sat on a fallen log to eat while the sun dropped lower in the sky. The first night came on quickly. The woods turned black in less than an hour, and the still water of the lake became a mirror for the stars. I sat there for a long time listening to the faint splash of fish breaking the surface. I felt small but calm. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was tired in a way that felt good. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, The silence pressed harder against my ears. Then I started hearing things. Small cracks in the brush, a twig snapping, a shuffle in the leaves. At first I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer moving around in the dark. But some of the sounds felt too heavy, too close. I gripped my knife under my pillow and told myself not to overthink it. Still, I kept waking up every hour, checking the walls of the tent for shadows. Nothing was there. By morning I felt drained, like I hadn't slept at all. Daylight made me feel foolish for being scared. The woods looked harmless again, and the air was cool and fresh. I ate some oatmeal and decided to walk around the lake. The trail along the shore was faint but still visible. The water was black, reflecting the trees, and I could see no signs of people anywhere. Halfway around, I spotted something odd. A small patch of ground had been disturbed. The dirt was loose, as if someone had dug there. I crouched down and saw marks in the soil, maybe from a shovel. There were no plants growing over it yet, which made me think it was recent. The patch was about 3 feet long, maybe 2 feet wide. My stomach tightened as I realized it looked almost like a shallow grave. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have. Could have been nothing, maybe someone burying food scraps to keep animals away. But the size and shape gnawed at me. I tried to shake it off and kept walking. When I got back to camp, I noticed something else. My pack was leaning differently than I had left it. I was sure I had propped it upright against the log, but now it was lying on its side. I opened it and checked. Nothing seemed missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had gone through it. That night was worse. As soon as darkness fell, the sounds started again. Heavier steps this time, moving just outside the circle of my camp. I turned off my lantern and sat inside my tent with the knife in my hand. Heart pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The steps circled, then faded, then came back. I could almost picture someone standing just beyond the trees, watching. I barely slept. When morning came, I stepped outside and found more signs that I hadn't been alone. Pine needles had been brushed aside near the edge of camp, as if someone had walked back and forth repeatedly. The ground was scuffed with shoe prints, not boots, but sneakers. I didn't know whether to pack up and leave or stay. Part of me felt stupid. Maybe it was just a hiker passing through. But hikers don't usually circle camps at night, and hikers don't mess with bags. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my fire going late and stayed awake, sitting on the log with my back against the tent. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, careful, crunching over twigs. I gripped my knife and held still. My fire had burned low, so the shadows were thick. Then I saw him, a man standing between the trees, just far enough that I couldn't see his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. My mouth went dry. I froze, afraid that if I moved, he would come closer. After what felt like forever, he stepped back into the darkness and was gone. I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as there was light, I packed everything into my bag. I didn't eat, didn't rest, just tore the tent down and stuffed it into my pack. I didn't even look back at the lake. I just wanted to get out. The trail back felt longer than before. Every snap of a branch made me whip my head around. Several times I thought I heard someone walking behind me, but when I stopped, the sounds stopped too. My hands shook the whole time I gripped the straps of my pack. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried with relief. But then I saw something that made me stop cold. On the hood of my car, stuck under the windshield wiper, was a folded piece of paper. I approached slowly, my stomach twisted into knots. I pulled the paper free and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, scrawled in black ink. It said only one sentence: "Don't come back." I stood there holding the note, looking around at the empty woods. The silence was louder than ever. Whoever had been out there had followed me all the way back. Maybe they had been watching from the moment I arrived. I unlocked the car with shaking hands, threw my bag inside, and drove as fast as the gravel road would let me. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never reported it. I told myself maybe it was just some local who didn't want strangers near the lake. But deep down, I know it was more than that. Someone had been out there watching me sleep, circling my camp, walking the same trail I walked. someone who wanted me gone. And I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes on me from the dark trees. I never went camping alone again. I always thought I was comfortable in the woods. I grew up going on short hikes with my family, camping near lakes and fishing along streams. I wasn't an expert, but I knew enough about trails, maps, and basic survival to keep myself calm whenever I went out. Over time, I developed a certain confidence in the idea that I could handle being alone in the forest. It was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, a place to clear my head. That's what I thought the day I drove out to the deep woods by myself, heading farther than I ever had before. The place I chose was far from the usual campgrounds. It wasn't one of those maintained trails where you can hear cars if you stop and listen, or where other hikers pass by every few minutes. This was an area tucked into the hills, dense with pines and thick brush, the kind of forest where the trees crowd out most of the light. I had marked the trailhead on a map I printed out, but it wasn't an official trail. It was an old logging path, half overgrown and barely visible on satellite images. That was part of why I chose it. I wanted quiet, something away from the noise, a place where I wouldn't hear anyone else. When I parked, the gravel lot was empty. The sun was just past its highest point in the sky, and it was warm, the kind of warm that makes you sweat the second you step out of the car. I packed my bag carefully, double-checking food, water, a small hatchet, sleeping bag, tarp, flashlight, and a knife I kept in my belt. I wasn't planning to stay for more than a night, maybe two, but I wanted to have enough in case I decided to linger. The idea was to hike a couple of miles into the woods, set up camp, and just sit with the silence. The first hour on the trail wasn't bad. The path dipped into the trees quickly, and within minutes I felt swallowed by the woods. The canopy above blocked most of the sunlight, making everything darker, cooler, and quieter. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. I could hear my own breathing and the crunch of twigs under my boots more than anything else. No cars, no voices, not even the hum of insects at first. I found it calming, but as I kept going, I noticed the path was worse than I expected. Fallen branches, brush, and roots cut across it in places, and at times it seemed to disappear altogether. I had to stop and check my bearings often, making sure the direction matched what I had marked on my compass. It didn't bother me at first. That was part of the appeal. A trail that barely existed meant fewer people had been there in years. After another hour, I stopped for water and leaned against a tree. My shirt was stuck to my back with sweat, and I could feel insects landing on my skin every few seconds. I took my pack off and set it down. That's when I realized how thick the silence had become. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, pressing in from all sides. Normally in the woods you hear something, even if it's faint. A bird, a woodpecker, the wind moving through branches. Here there was nothing. No movement in the underbrush, no sound of water nearby, not even the buzz of flies. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched even when you know you're alone. I shook it off and kept walking, but the farther I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. The trees looked the same in every direction. Straight trunks rising high with branches only starting far above, all of them pressed close together. The trail was almost gone now, nothing more than a faint line between patches of thick ferns. I told myself I could always turn back if it got worse, but something in me wanted to keep pushing forward, just to see how far the woods really stretched. It must have been close to evening when I finally picked a spot to set up camp. The ground leveled out near a cluster of rocks, and there was just enough open space to clear an area for a small fire. I set my tarp between two trees, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered some branches. Everything felt routine, but my hands kept moving a little faster than usual, like my body knew something my mind didn't. I tried to ignore it, focusing on building a fire. When the flames caught and started licking up toward the branches, I sat back on my pack and drank from my bottle. The light of the fire pushed back the dark around me, but beyond that circle it was already pitch black. The woods had swallowed the last of the day without me noticing. It wasn't just dark, it was absolute. My flashlight beam didn't seem to reach far before the trees cut it off. That night, lying on my back in the sleeping bag, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. At first it was faint, like small branches snapping in the distance. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but then it came again, closer, sharper, like something stepping on sticks. I turned onto my side and gripped the knife near my bag. I listened for so long that my ears began ringing from the effort. Nothing else followed, but the silence after was worse. I didn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time. By morning, I was exhausted. The fire had burned to ash, and the air was damp with dew. I packed quickly, deciding I'd head back toward the car instead of pushing farther. The woods didn't feel the way I hoped they would. They felt heavier, like I had crossed into somewhere I shouldn't be. But when I started walking back, I realized I couldn't find the trail. I had marked the general direction with my compass, but the faint line I followed in had vanished. The forest floor looked the same in every direction. I turned, walked, turned again, but nothing seemed familiar. My stomach tightened, and I forced myself to slow down, not to panic. I tried to retrace my steps carefully, but every tree looked identical. By midday, I admitted to myself I was lost. I stopped, dropped my pack, and took a long drink. My hands were shaking. I told myself I could still find the way if I kept steady, but the air around me felt different now. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was suffocating. I walked for hours, trying different directions, but the woods stretched on endlessly. Every clearing led to more trees, every ridge to another slope. I didn't see any streams or signs of animals. It felt unnatural, like the woods had swallowed everything living. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I didn't want to draw attention, though I couldn't explain to myself what I was worried about. I just lay on the ground, clutching my knife, staring into the dark. My ears picked up every tiny sound. The rustle of leaves, a thud somewhere far off, something brushing against bark. My chest tightened every time. I couldn't tell if it was just my mind filling in the silence or something real moving around me. The second morning I felt weak, my throat dry. I rationed what little water I had left, but the food was almost untouched. Couldn't eat. My stomach was too tight with fear. My legs felt heavier each mile I pushed through brush and branches. Around midday, I found something that made my chest go cold. A tree stood ahead, and at its base, the ground was disturbed. The soil was loose, darker than the earth around it, like it had been dug up recently. I crouched near it and saw what looked like the corner of a tarp half buried. The dirt pressed over it wasn't old. It looked fresh. I froze there, staring at it, my body refusing to move. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know what was under there. But the realization hit me harder than anything else had, that someone had been here recently, and they hadn't wanted anyone to know. My head spun. My first thought was to get as far away from it as I could. I backed up slowly, watching the trees, my skin crawling. The woods weren't empty. Someone else was here, maybe more than one person. And if they had buried something, I didn't want to meet them. I turned and started moving faster, trying to stay quiet, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that spot. My mouth was dry, and my shirt was soaked in sweat. Every few steps I thought I heard something behind me. Twigs snapping, a shift in the brush, but every time I spun around, the forest stared back, empty and still. I kept walking until the light started fading. My legs felt like they might give out, but I forced myself forward. I didn't dare stop. I didn't want to stay in one place long enough for anyone to find me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat against a tree, clutching my knife, listening. The woods stayed dark, silent, pressing in. Every now and then, I swore I saw movement between the trunks. A shadow crossing, a figure half hidden. But when I blinked, there was nothing. My chest hurt from how hard my heart was beating. By the third morning, I was stumbling. My water was gone. My lips cracked. I pushed through the woods blindly, every step heavier than the last. I tried to remember the direction of the road, but nothing lined up anymore. The forest was endless, unbroken. And then, Faintly, I heard it: water. A thin trickle at first, but unmistakable. I turned toward it, forcing my legs to move, and broke through a line of brush to find a narrow stream running between the trees. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. I dropped to my knees and drank straight from it, the cold water burning down my throat. As I knelt, I had always thought I understood what it meant to be alone in the woods. I had been camping before, hiked trails that stretched miles away from towns, even spent weekends at cabins that sat far off dirt roads. But nothing ever compared to the time I wandered deeper than I should have, into land that didn't have trails or markers, into a place that swallowed me whole. It wasn't the kind of trip that started with a grand plan. It was random, something I did on a whim because I felt restless. I told myself it would just be a quick overnight in the deep woods, a chance to clear my head, maybe see something different, maybe push myself a little. But it turned into something I will never forget, something that still shakes me when I think about how close I came to not walking out again. The day I went in, the air was hot and heavy. Summer had been dry, and the ground crunched beneath my boots in some places where pine needles had browned and dried up. I parked my car at the end of a dirt pull-off, a spot I had found by scrolling through satellite maps online the night before. There wasn't a trailhead, no marked path, just a patch of woods that looked thick and endless. That was the appeal. I wanted real woods, not the kind where you still hear cars on the highway or see other hikers. I wanted to be swallowed up, to feel like I was the only one there. That was exactly what I got, only it stopped being something I wanted once I was in too deep. I slung on my pack and headed straight in. The trees closed around me quickly, tall pines mixing with oaks and maples, their branches weaving together to block out much of the sun. At first, the ground sloped gently, but then it dropped, and I found myself descending into darker parts of the woods where undergrowth grew thicker and ferns fanned out wide. I stopped a few times to drink water and check my position, but since I had no marked trail, I relied only on the little compass clipped to my pack and my own sense of direction. At first, it felt like freedom. The air was still, the sounds of birds and insects constant, and the deeper I went, the more it felt like I had left the world behind. I thought I'd walk a few miles in, find a clearing, set up camp, and head back out in the morning. That was the plan, but plans dissolve fast when you underestimate how big the woods really are. By the time I had walked for several hours, I realized the ground had changed. The soil became soft and damp, sucking at my boots, and patches of swampy water reflected the dull sky through the canopy. Mosquitoes swarmed around me, biting at my arms and neck. I pushed further, thinking I'd get through the low ground and find solid footing again. But it stretched on farther than I thought, and soon I was weaving through trees that grew close together, their roots twisting out of the ground like veins. My legs grew tired, and sweat soaked my shirt. When I finally found higher ground again, I felt relieved. But when I looked around, I couldn't recognize anything. The trees all looked the same, and no matter how I turned, there was no sign of where I had come from. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my compass. I had water, food, and my tent. I'd just pick a direction, keep steady, and camp when it got dark. The deeper I went, the stranger everything began to feel. The forest grew quieter. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the normal chorus of birds and bugs had dulled. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen, waiting for something to break the silence, but only the faint rustle of leaves far above moved the air. I tried to ignore it and pushed on, but the quiet worked on me, made me aware of every crunch my boots made, every snap of a twig. My skin prickled, and I found myself turning to look behind me more often than I wanted to admit. There was never anything there, just trees and shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had gone into a part of the woods where even the animals didn't like to be. I picked a spot before sundown, a patch of flat ground between thick trees. I dropped my pack, set up my small tent, and gathered some wood. There was plenty of dry debris on the ground, branches that snapped easily in my hands. When I got the fire going, the glow eased my nerves a little. I cooked a packet of food on my small stove, ate quickly, and sat by the flames as darkness crept in. The forest closed around me until the only thing I could see was the glow of the fire on the trunks nearby. I expected to hear the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, frogs, owls, but it was still mostly quiet, too quiet. The silence pressed in like weight, and I found myself listening harder than I wanted to, waiting for something to move in the dark. When a branch cracked far off, I jumped, staring into the black until my eyes blurred. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon, but my stomach stayed tight. I sat awake for hours, poking at the fire, listening, forcing myself not to crawl inside the tent where the thin nylon walls would block my view. I needed to see around me, needed to know nothing was creeping closer. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at me. I went inside the tent, zipped it shut, and lay down on my mat. Every little sound outside made my heart beat harder, but after a long time of staring at the roof of the tent, my eyes finally closed. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, my chest pounding. There was a sound outside, steady, slow, like crunching leaves. Someone, or something, was walking near my camp. I froze, holding my breath, listening as the steps circled. They weren't fast, not like an animal scurrying. They were paced, heavy, dragging in some parts. My mouth went dry, and I felt every hair on my arms rise. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. The steps moved away, faded, then came back again, closer this time. My throat tightened. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking out, but fear glued me to the mat. I lay there, my muscles stiff, until the steps eventually faded into the distance. I never heard them return, but I couldn't sleep again. I just waited for dawn, my ears straining at every faint noise. When light finally bled through the thin fabric, I unzipped the tent and crawled out. My fire had burned down to ash, and the woods looked different in daylight, less threatening but still strange, like they were watching me. I checked around my camp, scanning the ground. My stomach turned when I saw marks in the dirt, impressions that looked like footprints. They weren't sharp enough to be certain, but the shapes were there, pressed into the soil where something had walked. They circled wide around my tent, coming close, then pulling back. My heart thudded as I stared at them. I told myself they were just animal tracks, distorted by the ground, but deep down I knew better. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking, and told myself I'd head straight back the way I came. Only I didn't know the way anymore. I walked for hours, keeping my compass steady, but the land twisted and shifted. The swampy ground appeared again, stretching wider this time, and I struggled through muck that pulled at my boots. I fell once, catching myself on my hands, and when I stood, the stink of rotting vegetation clung to me. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I'd find higher ground, but the forest seemed endless. I never saw a trail, never saw a clearing, only trees crowding closer, branches clawing at me as I pushed forward. The silence stayed heavy, broken only by the occasional crack that made me whip my head around, my pulse racing. By the second night, I was exhausted. I picked another spot, too tired to keep going. I built a smaller fire this time, conserving my fuel, and ate sparingly. As I sat by the flames, my nerves stretched thin. I thought I heard movement again, far off but deliberate. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. I stayed awake most of the night, dozing only in short bursts, always waking with the feeling that something was standing just out of view. My food supply shrank, my water nearly gone. I had to find a way out soon. The third day was worse. My compass needle spun strangely in my hand, twitching as if it couldn't find north. I felt dizzy, my legs sore, my throat dry. The woods stretched on forever, no landmarks, no breaks. Just when I thought I couldn't walk further, I stumbled onto something that froze me where I stood. It was a pile of bones, bleached and scattered, half hidden in leaves. They weren't animal bones. They were human. The skull lay tilted to the side, hollow sockets staring. The ribs were collapsed inward, the spine twisted. I stood there shaking, my stomach turning as I tried to make sense of it. My chest tightened with the realization that whoever had been out here before me never made it back. My breathing quickened, and I forced myself to turn away, but the image burned into my head. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark, clutching the small knife I carried, listening as movements circled me again. This time, it didn't stay far away. Branches snapped closer, footsteps slow, steady, deliberate. My skin crawled as I realized whatever was out there had been following me since the first night. It wasn't chance. It wasn't me. I always thought I understood the woods. I grew up around them, spent most of my free time walking trails, camping, fishing, and learning how to handle myself outside. It wasn't new to me, and I wasn't the type to get spooked by the dark or by being alone far from people. The silence of the woods never scared me. It usually gave me a strange comfort. But this trip into the deep woods was different. I wasn't going to a marked trail or a popular spot where weekend campers go. I wanted to test myself, to go deeper than I ever had, far away from the noise, to see what it felt like to be fully isolated. It started as a challenge I set for myself. I had a week off work and decided to spend at least 4 nights in the woods, completely alone. I packed light but with enough to keep me alive. Tent, sleeping bag, food rations, knife, hatchet, flashlight, spare batteries, rope, water filter, and some clothes sealed in a waterproof bag. I had my old external frame pack loaded and balanced the way I liked it. My boots were broken in and solid, good for long hikes and rough ground. The area I picked wasn't on any regular camping map. I'd seen it once while going through an old Forest Service survey online. It was a stretch of state land deep behind 2 ridges, the kind of place where trails disappeared and only game paths cut through. There weren't any cabins or maintained routes in there, at least not from what I could tell. That was the whole point. I wanted to know what it felt like to be deep enough that I wouldn't see another human being for days. The first day was just the hike in. I parked my truck on the edge of a gravel service road, locked it, and started walking before sunrise. At first, there was still the faint sign of human use, beer cans in the ditch, shotgun shells from hunters. After a couple miles, that was gone. The trail narrowed, then turned into a footpath, then into nothing but faint flattening of grass that might have been from deer. My GPS still worked, though I had a paper map too. I knew roughly where I wanted to go. An old riverbed that had dried into a basin deep in the woods. By the time I reached it, the sun was sinking and I was exhausted. The basin was broad and flat, filled with tangled brush and young trees, but the edges had enough clear ground for me to set up camp. I pitched the tent, filtered water from a shallow stream nearby, and heated a quick meal over the small stove. Everything felt normal, quiet but normal. That first night, the woods were alive with sound. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional call of something larger. A coyote yipped in the distance. I'd heard them plenty of times before and didn't think much of it. I zipped into my bag and let myself drift off, feeling proud of how far I'd come. The second day, I explored. I left my pack at camp, just carried water, knife, and a small pouch of food. I walked farther along the basin, climbing through thickets, following game trails. The woods felt endless. Every ridge led to another. Every hollow opened into another stretch of trees. It was exactly what I wanted, deep, quiet, and empty. But around mid-afternoon, I started noticing signs that didn't sit right with me. First, it was little things. Branches broken off clean at chest height. Not just fallen, but snapped hard. A pile of stones stacked near the base of a tree. Not natural looking at all. I crouched by it for a while, trying to decide if it was something an animal could have done. It didn't look like it. The stones were too neatly placed, one on top of the other. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe hunters, maybe surveyors, maybe just some kids years ago. Still, it stayed in my head the rest of the day. When I got back to camp, nothing looked disturbed. My tent was fine, my gear was where I left it. I made dinner and tried to relax, but the woods seemed quieter than the night before. Fewer crickets, fewer frogs. I told myself it was just me noticing things too much. I lay down, but it took a long time to fall asleep. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. It was still dark. I couldn't tell what time it was, but the woods were silent, completely silent. No bugs, no wind, nothing. I listened hard and thought I heard something moving outside, slow and steady, not crashing like a deer but not light like a fox either. I held my breath. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, gripping the handle of my knife inside the sleeping bag. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, scanning the ground. The dirt and leaves looked normal, except for one patch of soil pressed down near the tree line. Not a boot print, not exactly, but something pressed hard enough to flatten the leaves. I stared at it, uneasy. That day, I decided to push even farther. Maybe I was just spooking myself. I hiked away from camp, climbed up a ridge, and tried to get a sense of the land. From up there, I could see rolling forest in every direction. No smoke, no sign of people, just endless green. But when I turned to head back down, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Across the ridge, maybe 200 yards away, there was another small clearing. And in the middle of it stood what looked like a rough shelter. Branches leaned against a trunk, bark stripped away, almost like a crude hut. I froze. My first thought was that maybe someone else was out here. Hunters, trappers, squatters, it could happen. But the shelter didn't look fresh. It looked worn down, like it had been there a while, though not rotted away. I didn't go closer. Something about it told me not to. I turned and went back to camp, keeping a quicker pace than before. That night was worse. I tried to calm myself, cooked a meal, cleaned up carefully, and sat by the dim light of my flashlight until I felt tired enough to lie down. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept listening. And again, sometime in the night, I heard movement. This time closer. Slow steps in the leaves, then stopping. Then again. Always stopping when I strained to listen hardest. I didn't move. I lay in the bag, sweating even though the air was cool. Hours seemed to drag by. When dawn finally came, I forced myself out of the tent and looked around. This time I found something that made it impossible to keep pretending. About 20 feet from my tent, in the soft dirt near the stream, there were prints. Not clear boot prints, but the shape of feet. Bare feet, human-sized but wide, with long toes that dug into the mud. I stood staring at them for a long time, heart pounding. Someone had been there in the night, watching. I knew I should pack up and leave, but part of me resisted. I come all this way, gone deep into the woods to challenge myself. I didn't want to admit defeat because of some tracks. Maybe it was just some hermit or hiker passing through. Maybe it was nothing dangerous. That's what I told myself as I tried to calm down. I spent the day close to camp, gathering extra wood, keeping busy. I didn't wander far. I kept checking my gear, checking the edges of the clearing. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark with my knife in hand, flashlight off, listening. And I heard it again, the same slow, careful movement, circling this time. I could almost trace it by sound, moving around the clearing, stopping, moving again. At one point, I heard what sounded like a soft exhale, like someone trying not to breathe too loud. When morning came, I made my decision. I was done. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was out there, and they knew where I was. Maybe they had known the whole time. I packed fast, barely ate. My hands were shaking as I stuffed gear into my pack. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted out. But as I started hiking back toward the ridges, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every so often, I thought I heard steps behind me, faint but there. I didn't stop to check. I just kept moving. The woods felt endless, heavier than before. The trail I'd made on the way in seemed harder to follow. I kept second-guessing myself, checking the GPS, glancing at the map, sweating even though the air was cool. Hours passed, and I still hadn't reached the service road. My legs ached, my shoulders burned under the pack, and I started wondering if I'd gone off course. The ridges all looked the same. Then I came down into a hollow and froze. Ahead of me, stuck into the ground in a small clearing, was a stick with something tied to it. A strip of fabric, red, weathered, fluttering faintly in the breeze. It wasn't mine. I stood there staring, my throat dry. The ground around it was trampled, not by animals but by feet. Bare feet, I turned and pushed myself as hard as I could, climbing back up the ridge, crashing through brush, not caring about noise anymore. My pack caught on branches, tore at my shoulders. I kept going. The sun was dropping low when I finally recognized a landmark, a crooked pine I'd passed on the way in. Relief flooded me, but it was mixed with dread. If I was back on my own track, it meant whoever had left that marker knew my path too. I didn't stop until I saw the glint of metal through the trees. My truck, sitting on the edge of the road. My chest ached from how hard I was breathing. I stumbled to it. I always liked being alone in the woods. There was something about being away from people, away from phones and traffic and noise, that gave me a strange kind of peace. I thought I understood the forest well enough. I had camped in many places before, some close to home, some deeper into the wild, but that trip changed the way I saw the woods forever. It was supposed to be just a quiet few days by myself, a break from work, a way to reset. I picked a spot I had never been before, a stretch of national forest land that didn't have many trails. I read online that people rarely camped out there because it was so overgrown and hard to access. That was what drew me in. The more isolated, the better, I thought. I drove until the road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then narrowed down so much that I worried about scratching my truck. The trees closed in on both sides, tall pines and thick brush, branches clawing against the windows as I pushed through. I parked at the end of what looked like a forgotten logging road. The ground was uneven, covered with pine needles and soft dirt, and it smelled like resin and damp moss. From there, I loaded my pack and walked. The forest felt heavy in that area. The trees were so tall that even in daylight the ground stayed dim. I could hear nothing but my own steps and the occasional rustle of a bird lifting out of the brush. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how silent it became. It wasn't the kind of silence I knew from camping near lakes or rivers where water moved and frogs called. This was a still, heavy silence, like the air itself didn't want to move. I found a small clearing not much bigger than my tent, with a patch of flat dirt and some moss. I dropped my pack and stood there, breathing hard. The clearing felt hidden, like it hadn't been touched for years. Branches tangled overhead, and the ground was soft but firm enough for my tent. I set it up, laid out my sleeping bag, and stacked my food and supplies in a bear canister I had brought. Everything felt normal. That first night was uneventful. I built a small fire and sat beside it until the light drained out of the sky. The forest grew black quickly, the firelight catching on the trunks and throwing long shadows. The night air turned cold. I crawled into my tent and lay there, listening. The silence was so thick that every tiny sound, my breath, the rustle of the sleeping bag, felt magnified. I fell asleep eventually, though it wasn't a deep sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it. A sound in the distance. It wasn't an animal moving through brush. It was faint, but steady, like someone walking slowly. The steps crunched in the needles, stopped, then started again. They weren't close, but they were there. My heart beat faster. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe an elk. I tried to ignore it. The sound faded after a while, and I fell back asleep, though uneasily. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. I boiled water, ate, and went exploring. I didn't follow a trail because there weren't any. I just wandered, marking my way with bits of tape on branches so I could find my camp again. The forest was dense, but here and there I found strange signs. I noticed cut stumps, old ones, from when loggers had been in the area long ago. I found a rusted piece of metal half buried in the dirt, maybe part of an old saw or barrel. Then I found something that made me stop. It was a fire pit, but not like one made by campers. It looked old, with a ring of stones blackened by soot, and the center filled with ash. Moss had grown over some of the stones, which meant it hadn't been used recently. Still, it felt strange, like someone had once lived out there. As I moved farther, I came across another clearing larger than mine, with a rotten post sticking out of the ground. It looked like it might have once held wire or rope. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when you know someone else has been there before, even if it was years ago. I went back to my camp, keeping my eyes on the ground, following my tape markers. When I got back, I noticed something small but unsettling. One of the sticks I had stacked near my fire pit was out of place. I knew how I left them, in a neat pile, but one lay a little farther off, as if it had been picked up and dropped. Maybe I had done it without realizing, but it made me uneasy. That night, I sat by the fire longer, listening harder. The silence pressed in. Then, when I finally put out the fire and climbed into my tent, I lay awake, my ears straining. Hours seemed to pass before I heard it again. The sound of steps. This time they were closer. They came from one side of the clearing, slow, deliberate. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. My chest tightened. I held my breath, waiting. The steps circled slightly, not coming straight in but moving around the edge of where my tent sat. I could hear the faint snap of a twig. I thought of calling out, but I remembered I was alone, deep in the woods. My voice would sound weak in all that space. Instead, I stayed perfectly still. The steps moved away after what felt like forever, fading into the distance. Sleep barely came that night. When morning arrived, I stumbled out of the tent and checked the ground. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I noticed impressions in the soft dirt. Not clear prints, but enough to tell they weren't from an animal. The spacing, the shape, it looked like boots. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Someone had been out there, moving around my camp in the dark. I thought about leaving that morning, packing up, hiking back to my truck, and getting out. But I told myself maybe it was hunters or someone passing through. Maybe I was overreacting. The forest was big and people used it. I convinced myself to stay, though part of me knew it was a mistake. The day passed slowly. I didn't explore much. I stayed near camp, gathered wood, tried to focus on normal tasks. But the air felt different, heavier, as if the forest itself was aware of me. I kept checking the tree line, scanning for movement. That night, I didn't build a fire. I thought maybe if someone was out there, the fire would draw them in. Instead, I sat in the tent, the darkness outside pressing close. Hours dragged by. Then, sometime past midnight, the steps came again. This time, there was more than one set. I could hear them from different directions, slow, circling. My throat felt dry, my body frozen. The steps came closer than before. I could hear breathing outside. Not an animal. Human breathing, slow and steady. Then silence. I clenched my fists, waiting for the tent to move, for the zipper to rattle. But nothing happened. After a long stretch, the sounds faded again. When dawn came, I stepped outside, shaking, my nerves frayed. On the ground near the edge of my clearing, I saw it. A boot print clear in the damp soil. Next to it, another. The prints were deep, heavier than mine. I followed them a short way before they disappeared into brush. That was enough. I packed my gear in a rush, barely eating. The forest felt alive around me, like unseen eyes were tracking every move. As I slung my pack on, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Hanging on a low branch near my tent was a piece of rope. It hadn't been there before. It was tied in a loop, dangling. I didn't stay another second. I grabbed everything, even half-burned wood, shoved it into my pack, and started back toward my truck. My markers led me, but every step I expected to hear footsteps behind me. The silence pressed close, broken only by the pound of my heart. The walk back felt endless. Branches scraped my arms. The ground sucked at my boots, and I kept looking over my shoulder. More than once I thought I heard something, the faint crunch of movement, but when I stopped, everything went still. When I finally reached the logging road, my truck came into view like a lifeline. I threw my pack in the back and jumped inside. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine roared, and I backed out fast, dirt spitting under the tires. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't want to see if anyone was standing there, watching me leave. When I hit pavement again, I pulled over and sat there, my body trembling. I realized how close I had come to something I didn't want to understand. Whoever had been out there, they weren't hikers or hunters. They had been watching me, coming close, testing how far they could push. That rope hanging in the tree wasn't an accident. I never went back to that forest. Even now, when I think of camping, I remember the sound of those steps circling my tent in the dark, the breathing just outside the thin nylon wall. I thought I loved the silence of the woods, but that trip taught me that sometimes silence hides things you don't want to hear until it's too late. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the crowded streets and the endless sound of traffic. I picked a spot that wasn't too far from home but was deep enough into the woods to feel like I had escaped from everything. I didn't invite anyone else. I wanted the quiet, the solitude, and the freedom of being alone without anyone to bother me. The day I left, the weather was clear. The air felt heavy from the late summer heat, and the sun burned down on me as I packed my gear into my old backpack. I carried a tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, some food sealed in bags, and a small camp stove. I brought a knife, some rope, and a first aid kit just in case. I made sure everything was organized because once I got out there, I didn't want to dig through the bags searching for what I needed. The trail started easy, a wide dirt path with tall grass leaning over its edges. I could hear birds calling from high branches and the faint buzz of insects all around me. As I moved deeper, the trees grew thicker, their shadows spreading across the ground. The air cooled slightly under the shade, and the forest swallowed the noise of the outside world. My boots pressed into the dirt, crunching against dry leaves, and every step carried me farther away from comfort and closer to isolation. I walked for hours, the trail winding through hills and across shallow streams. My shoulders grew sore under the weight of the pack, but I told myself it was worth it. Finally, I found a spot that felt right. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, their needles carpeting the ground. A fallen log stretched across one side, half rotted and covered in moss. The place was quiet except for the distant tap of a woodpecker and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I dropped my pack, stretched out my arms, and began setting up camp. The tent went up first. I drove the stakes deep into the ground and made sure it was secure. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and placed my flashlight where I could reach it easily. I collected some dry wood and set a small fire pit with stones I found scattered around. By the time I had everything arranged, the sun was sliding lower through the trees, painting long shadows across the ground. I sat by the fire as it started to burn, heating a small meal on the camp stove. The smell of food mixed with the sharp scent of pine needles. I felt calm, almost happy. This was exactly what I had wanted, quiet, a place where I didn't have to answer to anyone. I ate slowly, listening to the forest. But as the light faded, the woods began to feel different. The trees that looked calm during the day now seemed darker, more crowded together, as if they were closing in around me. The forest sounds changed too. Birds went silent, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. The air cooled quickly, carrying with it the damp smell of earth. I told myself it was normal. Forests always grew quiet at night. I sat by the fire, adding more wood to keep it burning bright. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Every few minutes I thought I heard something moving beyond the trees. A shuffle of leaves, a faint crack of a branch. Always far enough that I couldn't see what caused it, but close enough to remind me that I wasn't in control of this place. When darkness fell completely, the forest turned into a wall of black. My firelight flickered across the trunks of trees, leaving everything beyond in shadow. I sat with my back to the log, trying not to focus on the sounds. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across the forest floor. I gripped the knife I had brought, holding it tight in my hand, though I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. I finally crawled into the tent, pulling the zipper closed. I lay in my sleeping bag, the thin fabric walls of the tent all that separated me from the darkness outside. I kept the flashlight beside me, clicking it on and off a few times before forcing myself to shut it. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the moon seeping faintly through the tent. That night, I barely slept. Every sound snapped me awake. I thought I heard breathing outside the tent at one point, slow and steady, not moving. I froze, barely daring to breathe myself. I gripped the knife again, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. After what felt like hours, the sound faded, or maybe it had never been there at all and my mind had twisted the wind into something else. Still, my heart thudded hard, and sleep only came in short, restless bursts. By morning, the forest felt normal again. Sunlight cut through the trees, the air warmed, and birds filled the woods with their calls. I crawled out of the tent, feeling exhausted but relieved. I made coffee on the camp stove, sipped it slowly, and tried to laugh at myself for being so tense the night before. I told myself it was just nerves. Being alone in the woods at night can make anyone hear things. I spent the day exploring around camp. I followed deer tracks through the mud near a stream, climbed a ridge to look out across the endless trees, and collected more wood for the fire. By the time the sun lowered again, I felt calmer, as if I had adjusted. But the second night was worse. I built the fire higher, keeping it bright as long as I could. But no matter how much wood I added, the darkness around me seemed heavier. The noises started earlier this time. I heard something large moving slowly through the underbrush, circling the clearing. My skin prickled, and I froze, staring into the dark. I never saw what it was, only caught faint glimpses of movement between the trees. I stayed by the fire until my eyes burned from fatigue. Finally, I retreated into the tent, knife in hand, flashlight ready. Sleep didn't come at all this time. Hours passed with me lying there, listening. At one point, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps right outside the tent. They stopped inches away from me. I held my breath so long my chest ached. Then I heard it, the sound of my fire being stirred, as if something or someone had kicked dirt across it. The light dimmed, the warmth faded. I lay frozen, sweat cold on my skin. When morning came again, the fire was nothing but a pile of dead ashes. I hadn't put it out. Something else had. My stomach turned as I packed some food and water into a smaller bag. I told myself I needed to leave, but part of me didn't want to give up, didn't want to admit that fear was pushing me away. I convinced myself to stay one more night. I regretted that choice. The third night was the worst. The forest felt alive with movement. I heard branches breaking deeper in the woods, then closer, as if something was slowly making its way toward me. I built the fire as high as I could, flames roaring, sparks shooting upward. I sat with my knife across my lap, eyes darting at every sound. At some point, I realized the woods had gone completely silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. The only sound was the fire. That silence pressed in on me harder than the darkness. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and steady, circling the camp. They weren't heavy like a bear, not quick like a deer. They were deliberate. They paused, then moved again. My mouth went dry, and my body locked in place. The steps came closer. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam cut only through a few feet of darkness before being swallowed whole. I thought I saw a shape move just beyond its edge. I blinked, and it was gone. I knew then I couldn't stay. When the first hint of dawn touched the trees, I tore down camp as fast as I could. My hands shook as I stuffed everything into the backpack, leaving behind what I couldn't carry. I didn't care about order or neatness. I just wanted out. The hike back felt longer than when I came in. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow between the trees looked like movement. I kept looking behind me, convinced something was following. At one point, I swore I saw a figure standing far back between the trees, but when I stopped to look, it was gone. My legs burned, my back ached, but I didn't stop. When I finally saw the trailhead, I broke into a near run, stumbling onto the gravel lot where my car waited. I threw the pack inside, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove off without looking back. I never went camping alone again. Even now, I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was a person. All I know is that I wasn't alone, and whatever it was wanted me to know it. I got out, but I still hear those footsteps in my head sometimes, slow and steady, circling in the dark. I had always liked being outdoors, but this time felt different. It wasn't a normal hiking trip or a weekend campout. I wanted to test myself to see how deep I could go into the woods without a marked trail, without a campground, without the normal comfort of knowing people were close by. I picked a stretch of forest I had read about, a place where loggers had stopped going decades ago, where the trees grew tight and thick, and where you could walk for miles without hitting a road or seeing another person. I packed enough food for 3 days, a good knife, a sleeping bag, a tent, a water filter, a small hatchet, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I left my phone in the car, partly because there was no service out there and partly because I wanted the silence. I parked off a dirt road where a small pull-off opened up. The forest already looked heavy from there. Tall pines blocked out the sky, and the air felt cooler the moment I stepped into them. The first hour of walking wasn't bad. I had daylight, my pack felt light, and I felt sharp and steady. I followed a deer trail at first, narrow and pressed into the ground. But after a while, even that faded, and I was just moving between trees, stepping over roots and stones, brushing aside ferns and thorny vines. The deeper I went, the less the world looked touched. There weren't beer cans or old fire pits, no signs of logging, no faint hum of traffic in the distance, just the press of branches, the crack of sticks under my boots, and the constant shuffle of leaves overhead. It felt strange how fast the forest swallowed me. When I turned back to look behind me, I couldn't even see the direction I had come from. Every way looked the same. I had brought a compass, so I kept checking it, making sure I was walking straight. My plan was simple. Go as far as I could during the first day, camp overnight, and then turn back the next day using the compass to keep me in line. I wanted to test myself, but I wasn't stupid enough to risk getting lost forever. Still, the deeper I went, the more I realized how easy it would be to disappear out here. A person could step off a road, walk a couple miles in, and never be seen again. By late afternoon, the trees grew thicker. Light barely reached the ground. I found a small clearing where the dirt was flat enough to set up my tent. I dropped my pack, rolled my shoulders, and listened. The forest had its own noises, but it wasn't busy like I expected. I heard a few birds, a woodpecker tapping somewhere, but mostly it was just still. Even the wind seemed to stay high up in the treetops. I built a small fire with dead wood and boiled some water for noodles. Eating alone in that kind of silence felt heavier than I thought it would. At home or even at a campsite, there's always something. A plane overhead, a car in the distance, other campers nearby. Out here, it was just me and the dark trees pressing close on every side. I kept thinking about how long it would take someone to find me if something went wrong. I didn't like that thought, so I pushed it away, crawled into my tent, and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep well. The ground was hard, but that wasn't the real reason. My body stayed tense, my ears tuned to every sound outside. I heard twigs snap a few times like something walking, but it could have been a deer. Once, I thought I heard breathing, slow and steady, not far from the tent. When I sat up and held still, it was gone. Maybe I had imagined it. Still, I stayed awake a long time, clutching my knife and staring at the thin fabric of the tent, waiting for morning. When light finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I made coffee, packed my gear, and kept moving deeper. The air smelled damp, like moss and dirt. My boots sank into soft patches, and my legs grew tired from stepping over fallen trees. The woods felt endless, repeating no matter how far I went. Around midday, I found something that made me stop. In the middle of the forest, where no trail should be, was a rusted metal barrel lying on its side. It was dented and half buried in leaves. Next to it was a broken plastic crate, cracked open, empty. Both looked old, weathered, as if they had been here for years. I crouched down, ran my hand over the barrel. I didn't like it. It meant someone had been out here before, maybe not recently, but far enough in that I should not have seen anything human. I looked around, half expecting to see more, but there was nothing. I walked on, trying to shake the feeling, but I couldn't stop thinking about how those things got there. Maybe hunters dragged them in. Maybe some old homestead had been nearby decades ago. The forest was full of forgotten junk like that, I told myself. Still, I checked my compass more often after that, wanting to stay sharp. The second night came faster than I wanted. I found another clearing, smaller this time, and set up camp again. The silence pressed heavier. I didn't hear birds anymore. Even the bugs seemed quiet. It was strange, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, I was just starting to doze when I heard footsteps. Not the kind of steps that crash through undergrowth like deer. These were slower, careful, spaced apart like someone walking on purpose. My chest tightened. I held still, listening, counting the steps. They stopped close, maybe 10 or 15 feet from my tent. I waited, holding my breath, gripping the knife again. Minutes passed. The sound didn't come back. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear circling. But bears don't usually stop like that, then disappear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I felt drained, like I was walking in a fog. I decided to turn back. I had gone deep enough. The forest was starting to feel wrong, and I wanted out. I checked my compass, shouldered my pack, and began the return trip. But something was off. After hours of walking, I expected to hit familiar landmarks, the fallen tree with the moss, the big boulder split in two. None of it came. I checked the compass again. I was walking straight, or at least I thought I was. But the woods didn't look right. Panic rose in me, but I pushed it down. I forced myself to keep walking, to trust the compass. The forest grew darker as the day thinned. My legs shook with exhaustion. At one point, I thought I saw movement behind me, a flicker of something slipping between the trees. When I turned, there was nothing. I kept going until I couldn't anymore. I dropped in another clearing, built another small fire. My hands shook as I tried to eat. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched. The silence wasn't natural anymore. It was too deep, too focused. That night was the worst. I heard the steps again, closer, circling. Sometimes it was branches snapping. Sometimes it was the faint rustle of leaves. Once, I swore I heard something brush the side of my tent. A light drag, as if fingers had traced along the fabric. I froze, my breath caught, heart slamming so loud I thought it would give me away. I held the knife until my hand ached. The sounds went on for hours, then faded just before dawn. When the gray light finally broke, I crawled out, eyes burning. The ground around my tent had faint impressions in the dirt. Not paw prints, not deer hooves, footprints. Bare, human, circling the tent. My stomach dropped. My mouth went dry. I knew then it wasn't my mind playing tricks. Someone was out here. Someone had followed me into the woods. Someone had been watching me the whole time. I didn't bother with breakfast. I packed fast, shoved everything into my bag, and started moving. I didn't care about the compass anymore. I just wanted out. I pushed through brush, scratched my arms, stumbled over rocks. I kept checking behind me, seeing shadows shift, never catching them fully. The forest felt endless, every turn the same, my chest tight with fear. By late afternoon, I found something I hadn't seen before, a structure. Not a cabin, not even a full shed, just a frame of old wood, half collapsed, leaning against a tree. Rusted can scattered around it, broken glass, a dirty blanket matted into the dirt. Someone had lived here or at least stayed here. It looked abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't stay long. The moment I stepped near it, the forest grew too quiet again, like it was waiting. I backed away and kept walking. The last night nearly broke me. I didn't even bother with a tent. I sat against a tree, fire burning low, knife in hand, waiting. The footsteps came again, just outside the circle of light. This time there was no mistaking them. Slow, steady, circling. I never saw the person, but I felt them, just beyond the dark. At one point, the fire dimmed, and I thought I saw a shape, tall and thin, standing between the trees, still as stone. When I blinked, it was gone. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I just sat there until the sky began to pale. When morning came, I ran. My legs screamed. My pack dragged me down. but I kept running. I stumbled, fell, got back up. Hours passed in a blur of trees. And then, finally, like a miracle, I heard it. The faint roar of traffic, far off. I always liked being away from people, and the woods were the only place that gave me real quiet. I thought I knew what being alone out there felt like. I thought I understood the woods. But the deep woods are not the same as the edge of a hiking trail or a weekend campsite. The deep woods are something else entirely, and I learned that the hard way. It started with a plan I made for myself, just a trip I wanted to take to clear my head. I picked a spot that wasn't marked on the popular maps, just a wide green section that stretched out on satellite view with no roads, no cabins, no trails, no signs of people for miles. That's what pulled me in. I wanted to go somewhere that felt untouched, somewhere that felt like no one had walked through in years. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off along a back road and loaded everything into my pack. Tent, sleeping bag, food sealed tight in bags, extra clothes, water filter, knife, flashlight, and a small axe. I checked it all twice before walking in. I didn't bring a GPS, just a compass and a map, because I thought I'd rely on myself like the old days. It was a mistake I didn't realize until it was too late. The first few hours were fine. I moved deeper and deeper, past where the trail markers ended, through thicker brush, over fallen trees slick with moss. The air grew cooler, damper, darker. The sun barely reached the ground in some parts because of how tall the pines were, stretching like black walls on every side. By the time I set up camp the first night, I was already deeper than I'd ever gone before. I set up the tent on a patch of flat ground between roots and made a small fire with dry sticks. The forest was silent. Not the kind of silence where birds rest, but the heavy silence that presses down and makes you feel like something is waiting. I told myself it was because I wasn't used to being this far from people. But it felt different, sharper, almost like the woods themselves were paying attention to me. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Every little sound carried too far. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just squirrels, maybe deer, but it kept me awake. My tent felt paper thin, the nylon walls no protection at all against the dark pressing in around me. The next morning, I pushed deeper. I wanted to reach a stream I had seen on the map. It meant I'd have fresh water without needing to boil or filter from puddles. The land sloped down for miles, gullies cut into the earth, rocks slick with moss. My boots stayed wet most of the day. I finally found the stream, wide and cold, moving fast enough to cover any sound in the forest. I decided to set up camp near it. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. On the far bank of the stream, maybe 30 feet away, the ground was torn up. Not just trampled, but dug into like something heavy had clawed or shoved the earth aside. The dirt was scattered, roots pulled out, small branches snapped. At first, I thought it was a bear, but there were no prints, no clear shape to the mess, just ground ripped open. I told myself an animal had been digging for grubs. Still, the sight left me uneasy. That night by the stream, the sounds were worse. The rushing water covered the smaller noises, but it also meant I couldn't tell what was out there. I kept thinking I saw movement between the trees on the far bank, just shapes shifting when I stared too long. My fire burned low, and I sat there for hours staring at the dark line of trees. At some point, exhaustion dragged me down and I fell asleep sitting up. I woke to the sound of something moving near the tent. Not leaves falling, not the scurry of a small animal, but steady steps circling. My hand went straight to the knife. My breath was loud in my own ears as I listened. Frozen. The steps moved slow, one at a time, crunching the wet ground, circling wider around me. I wanted to believe it was a deer, but deer don't circle. They move past. This felt deliberate. The steps faded after what felt like forever, and I forced myself to lie still until dawn. When the light finally came, I stepped outside, heart pounding, scanning the ground. There were impressions in the wet dirt, but not clear enough to tell what made them. Too wide for deer, too strange for boots. The ground was too soft to hold detail, but I could see the path circling the tent. I packed quickly that morning, stuffing everything into my bag, and decided to move on. I told myself maybe I was just scaring myself. Maybe my brain was twisting normal sounds into something else. But the feeling didn't leave me. It clung to me with every step I took. The deeper I went, the more the woods changed. Trees grew closer together. Their branches knotted like ribs over my head. The ground was uneven, soft in some places, rock hard in others. Fallen trees blocked the way, forcing me to climb and crawl. I stopped checking the compass as much, stopped checking the map. I just wanted to put distance between me and that stream. By the third day, I noticed something worse. The woods felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the sense that I wasn't moving through empty forest, but through something that had been disturbed, unsettled. Deadfall piled in strange ways, not natural collapses but stacked like barriers. I found another torn-up patch of ground. Roots pulled out again, dirt scattered. Then another, and another, miles apart, like something had been moving through and leaving a trail of damage. Food started to feel tasteless in my mouth, and I stopped eating much. My nerves stayed wound-tight every second. My flashlight batteries were already halfway gone, but I couldn't stop myself from using it at night, shining it into the trees every few minutes to make sure nothing was moving. That night, something came closer. The first sound was branches breaking. Not a small crack, but a heavy snap, like something large stepping down hard. My fire was burning low, but I didn't move to feed it. I crouched inside the tent, knife in hand, barely breathing. Another snap, closer, then silence. My ears rang with how hard I was listening. Then I heard it again, the slow steps circling. Not rushing, not charging, just moving with heavy patience. Around and around, closer than before. My skin went cold, my heart slamming. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But where? Out there was worse than in here. I stayed awake until daylight, eyes wide, knife clutched. When I stepped outside, there were more impressions in the dirt. Not paw prints, not boots, just shallow, wide depressions, as if something heavy but soft had pressed down. That morning, I finally admitted I was lost. I had stopped paying attention to the map 2 days ago, moving only with fear and not direction. I checked the compass, tried to set a course west to reach the road again, but every step felt the same. The woods pressed in, endless, repeating, no landmarks that held. By late afternoon, I stumbled into another torn-up patch of ground, but this one was fresh. The dirt was damp, roots still wet from being ripped out. The air smelled sharp, like fresh earth. I crouched there staring, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something else. Shreds of fabric caught on a broken branch. I froze, staring at the pale gray strips flapping in the breeze. It wasn't mine. It wasn't from gear. It looked like old shirt fabric, weathered, torn. My stomach turned as I realized I wasn't the first person to come this deep. The sun set before I could find another place to camp, and I ended up in a hollow surrounded by high trees. I didn't light a fire. I didn't move. I just sat in the dark with my back to a log, knife in hand, waiting. I heard it again that night, but this time it didn't circle. The sound came straight in, branches snapping, ground shifting under weight. My chest tightened as I gripped the knife tighter, eyes wide in the dark. Then it stopped, so close I could almost feel the ground vibrate under me. Silence stretched so long I thought I'd gone deaf. Then, slowly, it began to move again, further out this time, fading until there was nothing. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, my hands were shaking. I forced myself to move, pushing west, ignoring hunger, ignoring thirst. I had to get out. My whole body screamed to keep going, to never stop. By midday, I found something that broke me. Collapsed tent. The fabric was torn, shredded, and the frame bent. Around it, the ground was ripped up worse than anywhere else I had seen. Gear was scattered, some half buried in the dirt. A rusted pan, a boot with the sole half rotted off, scraps of fabric. It had been here for years, but it wasn't just decay. The way the earth was ripped told me the same thing had been here, circling them like it circled me. I stared at it until my vision blurred. Whoever camped here hadn't left on their own. My legs carried me without thought after that, stumbling, half running through brush and mud, my pack tearing on branches. Hours passed, sun dropping lower, shadows stretching longer. I didn't care. I kept going, lungs burning, heart racing. And then I saw it, the thin line of a dirt road through the trees. I don't even remember crossing the last mile. I had been planning the trip for weeks before I finally went. The idea was simple. I wanted to push myself deeper into the woods than I had ever gone before, far past where most campers and hunters usually stayed. I didn't want the sound of cars in the distance or the glow of cabin lights through the trees. I wanted to be swallowed whole by the forest, with nothing around me but the sound of wind and the crack of branches under my boots. The place I chose was a thick stretch of land marked on the map as state forest, but most of it had no marked trails. A few fire roads cut across it here and there, but once you left those behind, it was just ridges, streams, and heavy timber that seemed endless in all directions. I had read that some people went out there to hunt, and sometimes surveyors pushed into it, but it wasn't a place most hikers bothered with. That was exactly what I wanted. I set out in late September, when the air was crisp but not freezing. The leaves were just starting to turn, and during the drive up I passed stretches of red, orange, and yellow trees that looked like they were glowing in the afternoon sun. By the time I parked on the side of the dirt road where I planned to start, the shadows were already stretching long. I slung my pack over my shoulders, checked the straps, and started down the first slope into the tree line. At first, the forest felt like any other. The path wasn't marked, but animal trails and faint cuts in the underbrush gave me enough direction. My boots sank softly into damp ground, the smell of rotting leaves strong in the cool air. Every so often, a bird flapped overhead or a squirrel darted across a log. It was peaceful in that way that woods always are when you first step into them. The deeper I went, the more the forest closed in. The sounds of the road faded. The trees grew closer together, tall oaks and pines that blocked out the light. The ground became uneven, slopes leading down into gullies and back up into ridges, covered with roots and rocks that made me slow down. I sweated under my pack even though the air was cool, and my shirt stuck to my back by the time I found a flat enough spot to stop and drink some water. I wanted to get at least 4 or 5 miles in before making camp. That way I would know I was really in deep, far enough that no one would just wander past me. So I pushed on, keeping my compass handy and marking the direction. The further I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. Birds still chirped, but the sounds seemed thinner. I didn't hear distant cars or voices, just the crunch of my own boots and the rustle of branches overhead. After a couple of hours, I came down into a low valley where a stream cut through. The banks were muddy, and deer tracks were stamped into the ground near the water. I filled my bottle and filtered it, then followed the stream further down, thinking it might lead me to a wider clearing where I could set up camp. Instead, the woods pressed in tighter, the ground soggy underfoot. My boots sank in mud, and my pack shifted with every step. It was getting late, and I didn't want to stumble around in the dark, so I turned away from the stream and climbed back up toward higher ground. By the time I found a flat ridge to stop on, the light was fading fast. I dropped my pack, stretched my aching shoulders, and started setting up camp. The spot wasn't perfect. There were roots under the soil and rocks scattered around, but it would do. I cleared an area, set up my small tent, and gathered some dead wood for a fire. Soon I had flames crackling, smoke drifting up into the darkening sky. The firelight lit the trees around me in a warm orange glow, and beyond that, the forest faded into black. I cooked a small meal, ate quickly, and sat back against a log, listening to the night. At first it was quiet, just the faint hiss of the fire. Then the woods came alive in their own way. An owl called somewhere overhead. Branches snapped as some animal moved through the underbrush. Far off, I thought I heard the high yips of coyotes. None of it bothered me. These were natural sounds, the kind you expect. What did bother me, though, was the feeling that grew as I sat there. It was subtle at first, just a faint prickling in the back of my neck. The sense that the dark beyond the firelight wasn't empty. Every time I glanced up from the flames, the trees seemed deeper, the shadows thicker. It was the kind of feeling you can't explain, only that it settles into you and makes you sit a little straighter, makes your eyes linger longer on the dark. I told myself it was nothing, just the normal unease of being alone out in the woods. I crawled into my tent after stamping out the fire and zipped myself in. My sleeping bag was warm, and I tried to let the steady sounds of the night lull me to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I woke more than once in the night, convinced I had heard something. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving somewhere near the camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound faded, and I told myself it was just an animal. Still, my heart pounded so hard it took an hour before I drifted off again. When morning came, I forced myself to shake off the uneasy thoughts. The sun was bright, the forest looked different, less threatening. I packed up, ate a quick breakfast, and pushed deeper. The next day was tougher. The ground grew rougher, the ridges steeper. I had to scramble up and down slopes, pulling myself up by roots, sliding on loose soil. My legs burned, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I stopped often, drinking water, chewing on trail mix, checking my compass to keep my bearings. But the deeper I went, the more something gnawed at me. I found myself stopping more often to listen. Sometimes I thought I heard the same snapping of branches behind me, not close, but not distant either. The sound of something keeping pace. Each time I turned, the woods were still. Nothing moved. By late afternoon, I was drained. I found another spot to set camp, this one in a low hollow between ridges. I set up my tent, built a fire, and tried to relax. The shadows grew long, and again that feeling returned, the heavy awareness of being watched. That night was worse. The sounds were clearer. I woke to the crunch of leaves, slow, steady, like someone circling the edge of my camp. I lay frozen in my bag, ears straining. It wasn't the random crashing of deer or the light scurry of raccoons. It was paced, deliberate. I waited until I couldn't stand it anymore, then unzipped the tent slowly and peered out. The fire was low, just glowing embers. The woods were pitch black. I saw nothing, but the silence pressed in heavy, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I tossed more wood on the fire, sat awake with my back against my pack, knife in hand. Hours dragged by. When dawn finally came, my nerves were shot. I thought about turning back, but I told myself I could handle it. It was just my mind playing tricks, so I kept going. The third day pushed me further than I had meant to go. I lost the stream I had been following, and when I tried to cut across the ridges, I got turned around. My compass pointed the way, but the land was a maze, and I found myself circling without meaning to. My legs ached and I stumbled more than once. That evening, when I finally set camp again, I felt more isolated than ever. The woods seemed endless, the trees packed tight, no sky visible through the canopy. I built another fire, but the light barely pushed back the dark. That night, the footsteps returned, closer this time. I sat awake again, gripping my knife, staring into the black. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. At one point, I was sure I saw movement, a darker shadow among shadows, slipping between trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had decided. I had gone far enough. Too far. It was time to turn back. But the forest didn't let me leave easily. The ridges all looked the same. Valleys led me in circles. Every landmark blurred together. I fought my way through brush, slid down slopes, climbed back up, sweat pouring down my face. My water ran low, and all the while I knew I wasn't alone. The sounds followed me, footsteps, snaps of branches, sometimes the faintest sound of breathing, carried on the still air. Not close, but never far, always there. That last night, I didn't bother with a fire. I crouched in the dark, pack against my back, knife in my lap. I listened, every nerve stretched tight. The sounds circled me, steady, patient. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't rushing. They were waiting. When the first light of dawn broke, I pushed myself up and ran. I didn't care about direction, only about moving. I stumbled, scraped my hands, tore my clothes on branches. I crashed through underbrush, lungs burning, ears filled with the pounding of my own heartbeat. Hours later, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief hit me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. I didn't stop, though. I followed it until I saw the faint shape of my car where I had left it days before. When I finally reached it, I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat behind the wheel, shaking. My clothes